Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting of the Cannabis Advisory Committee to order. I'd like to welcome you all for being here today and taking time out of your busy schedules to be here and give us some of your opinions on what we're doing and assist us with making decisions that will forward to the licensing, the licensing agencies. So with that, can I have a roll call, please?
Babuyan.
Here.
Dombrowski.
Here.
Heidelback.
Here.
Harada.
Here.
Huffman. Farrow.
Here.
Todd.
Here.
Leff.
Here.
Nebdal.
Here.
Nikita.
Here.
Peck.
Here.
Stevenson.
Here.
Sweeney.
Here.
Williams.
Here.
Here.
Woolsey.
Here.
Wu. You.
Here.
Quorum established.
Thank you. With that, we move to item number 2, a review of our minutes from March 27th from Sacramento, California. Are there any comments by any of the board members as to the accuracy of the minutes?
I move the adoption of the minutes.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Do we have any public comment? Seeing no one approaching the mic, and just to let you know that this dais will be where you can come up and approach and give public comment. Seeing none, can I take the roll?
Babuyan.
Aye.
Dombrowski.
Aye.
Heidelback.
Aye.
Harada.
Aye.
Huffman. Farrow.
Aye.
Todd.
Aye.
Leff.
Aye.
Nebdal.
Aye.
Nikita.
Aye.
Peck.
Aye.
Stevenson. Sweeney.
Aye.
Williams.
Aye.
Woolsey.
Aye.
Wu.
Aye.
You.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you very much. Moving on to item number 3, we have a presentation called the Tribal Participation in the Legal Cannabis Industry. David Villapiano, I don't know if that's the proper pronunciation. You can help me with it when you get up here. He's Executive Director. And Mark Livitan. Thank you, gentlemen.
Actually, you butchered the heck out of that.
So help me.
That's all right. David Villalpando.
Thank you, David.
I've had more practice. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to present tribal participation in the California cannabis market. As I stated, my name is Dave Villalpando. I currently serve as Executive Director for the San Isabel Tribal Cannabis Regulatory Agency for the Ipe Nation of San Isabel. It's a tribe of about 935 members, located about 40 minutes east of downtown San Diego, within San Diego County, on about 15,500 acres. I also serve as Executive Director for the California Native American Cannabis Association, a consortium of currently 25, soon to be 28 tribes that are involved in cannabis economic development. 35 tribes, actually, out of the 109 federally recognized tribes, have some form of economic development in cannabis. So we represent the majority of those tribes that are involved in economic development. And I'll talk about Sinaka in a second. But just to add some context to the presentation by point of reference, I am not a member of the tribe, Ipe Nation. I'm a tribal government employee. I've been employed actually with San Isabel since retirement from state service in 2012. My career track was 36 years in law enforcement, 27 years with the State Attorney General's office, the first 20 of those in the Bureau of Narcotic Enforcement on the other side of cannabis and a few other drugs. The last 7 years as regulator in the Bureau of Gambling Control. My last position was special agent in charge of the Bureau of Gambling Control in Southern California. So in terms of regulation, that's the point of reference that I come from. It's all about consumer protection, accountability of all things cannabis, and safety and security of the operation. So on to the presentation with regard to Sinaka. Sinaka has been around for a little over 2 years now. Ever since, actually prior to the passage of Proposition 64, when tribes were exploring cannabis. We're not the first. San Isabel's not the first. We've been in the cannabis business now for about 4 years. The tribe passed its statute in August of 2014 that permitted legal medicinal cannabis consistent with what was outlined in state law under 11362.5 of the Health and Safety Code. We created a statute and ordinance and regulations, and we've been in that business for about 4 years. We joined CNACA very early on, along with a number of other tribes who saw the advantage of sharing regulatory best practices, business best practices, and basically information on how we could do this industry best within our tribal nations. We do have a website, cnaca.us, where you'll find a lot of material referencing CNACA. Our mission statement is there, guiding principles, and we actually publish a set of professional standards that all member nations have subscribed to, which ensure accountability, consumer protection, and safety and security of our businesses. Here's a partial list of the tribes within California who are CNACA members. As I mentioned, we have 25 currently. From our membership meeting 2 days ago, we're going to have 3 additional tribes join us, and that's out of the 35. And the estimate is about 100 tribes across the country are involved in some form of cannabis development. One thing that might be instructive, there are several pieces of pending as well as ratified legislation, not the least of which is the Agriculture Improvement Act of 2018, that actually places tribes and states on equal footing with regard to recognition of tribal nations' right to establish statutes, establish codes to regulate legal cannabis within their tribal lands. I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Mark.
Thanks, Dave. Good morning, members of the committee. My name is Mark Levitan. I'm a tribal attorney. I've been tribal attorney for 25 years. So my expertise is in tribal sovereignty and federal Indian law. And when some of my more remote tribes located in California wanted to explore cannabis development, they turned to me and asked, how do we go about doing this? So we started to look at it from a tribal legal perspective. So just a little background for those members of the committee who may not really understand how tribes are different in terms of their legal status and tribal sovereignty. Tribes are referenced separately in the United States Constitution as separate governmental entities recognized by the United States government. In the state of California, tribes are subject to a federal law called Public Law 280, which was passed in the 1950s, which gave the state of California criminal jurisdiction on Indian reservations, but not civil jurisdiction on Indian reservations. So most of you are probably familiar, at least in a little bit, with the history of Indian gaming. What happened in Indian gaming was the tribes, once the state had legalized a little bit of casino gaming for charities, the tribes made the argument, well, the state has now transferred gambling from a criminal prohibitory status to a civil regulatory status. And now we have civil regulation on our reservations to institute our own gaming if we want to. That went up to the United States Supreme Court and the tribes were successful. So following in that similar kind of model, once the state legalized marijuana for some purposes, it took it out of the criminal prohibitory status and into the civil regulatory status, where tribes have the inherent right on their reservations to conduct their own marijuana legal programs if they want to. And so several tribes started to do that. Thanks. The issue then became, well, a lot of these tribes that wanted to get into it first, because of the federal status still being questionable, were not wealthy gaming tribes. They were remote rural tribes who didn't have access to large markets. And so when the state started to set up its market, those tribes were interested in trying to figure out a way to interface with the state market. So the tribes started to approach the counties and the state government to try to figure out a way to do this. Now, this was not without precedent. In Oregon, Washington, and Nevada, when those states legalized marijuana, the legislatures authorized the governors in those states to negotiate compacts with the tribes so that the states and the tribes could come to an agreement as to how the tribes could interface directly with the state cannabis market. And it wasn't rocket science. Basically, the tribes agreed to abide by the same testing standards, background checks, those kinds of basic substantive standards that the state did, that the state was imposing on its licensees. But the tribe set up its own regulatory system on the reservation to enforce those standards, which is consistent with all civil regulatory jurisdiction in the history of Indian country, that tribes do that for themselves on their reservations. With regard to taxation, the deal cut was the tribes would charge the same taxes that the state did. The tribes would keep those taxes, but they would charge the same level of taxation that the state did so that the tribes wouldn't be undercutting the state market. And that's been reasonably successful in all three of those states. So, did I skip anything? That looks good. Oh, did I skip one? Okay, I'll just wing it. So the tribes went to the state, and just a little bit of background on the state's approach to this so far, right? You had Prop 64. I've had conversations with the authors of Prop 64. They considered addressing tribes in Prop 64, and they decided it would complicate matters too much, and they should instead draft Prop 64 in such a way that the legislature and the governor would be able to come back and address tribes later on. So of course, after Prop 64 was passed, the governor's trailer bill came along to reconcile the medical and the adult use provisions. And again, the tribes approached the state, and the state said, this is so complicated right now. We're just going to have to wait and address the tribes later on. We're sorry. There's not time, there's not room in this space to address tribes. So the tribes approached the regulatory agencies involved and said, look, under Supreme Court precedent, it's clear that we have civil jurisdiction to do this, and it's clear that you need a regulatory program that applies to the whole state. You're going to have state consumers coming onto reservation lands to buy product. Why don't we figure out a way to make this work? We can use these models from other states. We know this legislature hasn't passed anything that delegates the authority to the governor. But that doesn't mean that you as state agencies don't have discretionary authority to adopt reasonable regulations. And we made, some headway in terms of those discussions over a period of months. And then we were told that the governor's office had told, this is under Brown's administration, had told those agencies anything having to do with tribes comes through us. With the help of Assemblyman Bonta, we introduced over a period of 3 years, 3 separate bills, which worked their way through various committees in the state legislature, culminating last year in AB 924. AB 924 was a fully fleshed out piece of legislation that had support from everybody who had opposed tribal legislation in this area the year before, including rural counties, labor unions, environmental groups, law enforcement groups. We had a tremendous amount of support behind AB 924. And it got killed in the Senate B&P committee. And we were told that primarily the reasons it was being killed were, one, the state agencies should have unfettered jurisdiction on Indian reservations in California to enforce state cannabis regulations, which I hope I've made the case is completely inconsistent with the entire history of federal Indian law and state and tribal relations. Two, the state taxes should apply, and the state should get the taxes. So you have what are we now in California, the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world, telling rural tribes in the middle of nowhere in the most impoverished areas of California that the state should get to keep all the taxes and the tribes shouldn't get them. So needless to say, that was a pretty offensive end to AB 924 last year. The governor's office, Governor Brown's office, worked with us on AB 924 in a positive way. We thought we were working along the same kind of elements that you would work through in a gaming compact. We thought we were making progress. They went radio silent on us for about a month and a half last spring. And then when they came back, they said, we have this great idea. Why don't we just amend state law to treat tribes like counties? That would just solve all our problems, wouldn't it? And we looked at them and said, okay, so if you treat tribes like counties, that means the state agencies have unfettered jurisdiction on Indian reservations, and all of the state taxes apply on Indian reservations and get paid to the state. No, thank you.
So let's talk about why it's advantageous for both tribes and the state of California for commercial cannabis operations, regulated cannabis operations to be developed on tribal lands. And I should preface that with the point of our presentation. The point that we would like to drive home is the frustration that tribal nations in this state are encountering in engaging with the state of California. Shortly after the new governor took office, CNACA sent a letter to the governor's office on day 2 requesting consultation so that we could talk about an agreement, talk about a consistent set of regulations, a consistent framework around which both tribes and non-tribal entities could do business in cannabis, and we have yet to receive a response. We've sent several letters, I know on behalf of Santa Isabel, to the Bureau of Cannabis Control, stating, look, we're regulators, government regulators in the cannabis world. If for no other reason than an exchange of information, education around industry best practices in regulating cannabis, can we get together and talk? We invite you to come down to the reservation. We have in our regulations an absolute 100% access, full transparency policy when it comes to governments. We've entertained visits from city councils, from county board of supervisors, regularly have the DEA task force visit just to see our operation. Border Patrol, California Highway Patrol, any number of law enforcement agencies, as well as tribal governments from across the nation coming to visit Santa Isabel to say, you guys have been in this business for 4 years, and it seems like you're doing something pretty well. We'd like to learn from your experience, but yet we try and engage with state regulators, and the response is silence. So that's the frustration we're experiencing as tribal nations, trying to interact with the state on a respectful government-to-government basis, let alone seeking a pathway for tribal participation in the California cannabis market off-reservation. So the advantages are, the perception is that, well, tribes are making tons of money for gaming. What do you need to get involved in cannabis for? Well, there's 61 gaming compacts, or compacts with 61 of the 109 tribes in California, and all but a handful of those, and Santa Isabel is a perfect example, can barely make ends meet from gaming. Santa Isabel had a casino for 5 years. Could barely make payroll. We had to close it in February 2014. So did our neighbors down the street in La Posta. So have a few others across the state. So gaming is not the pot of gold that a lot of people think it is. In fact, most of the tribes that can't succeed in gaming, like Santa Isabel, are located in rural areas of the state. Those same disadvantages with regard to gaming are distinct advantages in developing cannabis. Rural location. It's part of the argument that we made to our county board of supervisors, our county counterparts. We said, look, back in 2014, when it was medical marijuana under 11362, you would love to have Santa Isabel develop cannabis. Why? Because at that point, what you had was a whole plethora of member contributions, growing cannabis in their backyards, in spare bedrooms, in business strip malls, in residential areas. You had a lot of safety issues. You had kids jumping over the fence to rip out plants that were being grown for the... Not at Santa Isabel. I'll show you photographs. It's a secure location. It's out of the way. No one complains. No one has complained in 4 years. You can't smell it, you can't see it, and it's inaccessible to anyone with nefarious intent. Perfect location for development of regulated cannabis. And oh, by the way, that regulatory staff that I have, approximately 50 people now, are there 24/7. Unlike county regulators or city regulators or state regulators, It's not a transient visit by regulatory staff. We're there every single minute of every single day because it's a 24/7 facility. I have live monitored surveillance of hundreds of cameras. So from a regulatory standpoint, it is absolutely the most secure facility related to cannabis, I would venture to say in the country, but I won't go that far, in California certainly. If the state were to interact with tribes around cannabis, to have this collegial, respectful partnership with cannabis regulators on tribal lands, imagine this. Those regulatory agencies in the state share those best practices, and it's the tribe incurring the cost of making sure that those best practices are enforced with regard to cannabis operations on tribal lands, whether it's cultivation, manufacturing, process, or retail sales. It's the best of both worlds. I mean, I worked hard as a state gaming regulator to establish networking, intelligence, information sharing networks with my tribal gaming counterparts, regulatory counterparts in the gaming space. In the 3 areas that I had jurisdiction for, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Riverside. And that exchange of information paid tremendous dividends in terms of a more secure industry, the most highly regulated industry in the United States, that being gaming, and a very complementary relationship. I learned a lot as a state gaming regulator, but yet to have state cannabis regulators go, no. We'd rather not interact with you. Just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. And I alluded to it before, tribal nations have a long history of successfully regulating commercial enterprises in California. We put systems in place, regulations in place, and frankly, we're developing processes and dealing with issues at Santa Isabel, as are other tribes in this industry, that the state of California has yet to run into. I know for a fact. Issues that the state of California, just starting in the regulation of cannabis, have yet to confront, yet we've already dealt with them and developed processes and procedures to deal with those issues. So this is our facility at Santa Isabel, 15,500 acres we have. Only 9 acres is designated by our Tribal Development Corporation for the development of legal cannabis. We have 7 tenants currently. We have cultivators, we have manufacturers, we have 2 tribal-owned businesses, an edibles company where we're developing infused edibles on our property, and most recently, as of April of this year, the Mountain Source Dispensary. We changed our statute in April of 2018 to allow for both tribal ownership of cannabis, which was not allowed in the previous statute, and also retail sales. And I'll tell you quite frankly, that amendment, which the general membership of EPA Nation ratified, were in direct response to the state's failure to engage around Assembly Bill 924. Our tenants, all 9 tribal tenants up to that point, have millions of dollars invested in state-of-the-art practices. We define the industry best practices that our tenants have to pay for. That infrastructure represents the best that you will find in the industry. And I'll just give you an example. Water's a concern. It's a concern for everywhere. It's a concern for the general membership of EPA Nation. We have mandatory water conservation practices to the point where some of our cultivators are able to recapture 98% of the water used in their cultivation and recycle it. We have natural fed wells at the top of Volca Mountain. They feed wells down below. We have a 55,000 gallon water tank. We sound the tank monthly to estimate water usage. Our current usage of water with all the tenants that we have in cannabis, and you know cannabis is a water intensive industry, we're using 1/5 the water that the property was using when it was a full-on casino. 1/5. Water's not an issue. Environmental protection standards. We have very stringent environmental protection standards with regard to runoff, with regard to capturing, with regard to handling chemicals, with regard to pesticide application, not only at the cannabis facility, but even the outside of the facility. Regulations that are enforced on a day-to-day basis, as I mentioned before. Our dispensary, with no small measure of pride, represents the best that exists in the state of California. We have rules and regulations the state of California nor any county or city currently enforce. You have to be 21 just to get on property. You have to be 21 just to get on property. And there's about a half-mile road just to get up to the dispensary. There's a security kiosk. We have 24-hour security. And I relay this not to say that, not to stress it, San Isabel is the exception to the rule, but this is the direction that tribal nations are taking with regard to legal cannabis. In fact, at our meeting, we discussed a framework for a statewide tribal regulatory process, very similar to what you have in California as a regulatory agency for state-regulated cannabis operations. We're looking for that same consistency only among tribal nations. Those tribal nations that are members of CNACA. So, and I just entertained a visit from our local county board of supervisor, Diane Jacobs, somebody who is ardently against cannabis. I worked with Diane when I was assigned a DEA task force back in the 90s. She's very pro-law enforcement and very anti-drug, all aspects of drug. By the end of our 2-hour tour, she said, you guys are doing it better than the state of California. I have a higher level of confidence in the regulation and the processes that you have here than I do in what the state of California has established at licensed entities. I'll give you a quick example. So if you go to any state licensed facility, right? So mom or dad gets up in the morning and say, hey, come on kids, jump in the car. We're gonna run over, we gotta go do some shopping. They'll go to the dispensary, leave the kids out in the parking lot. There's no one there to object. Run in, buy their product, re-enter their car. Maybe they hit that vape pen or they use that product while they're in the car before they take off. Now you have somebody who's driving under the influence with kids in their car. Do you know at Santa Isabel, if you show up with kids, it's like, no, sorry, you're not shopping here today. Go away. We're down the highway. You cannot enter our property. You have to be over 21. In fact, we have a prohibition on any consumption of cannabis on property. We have the child-resistant packaging. We have rules, a set of rules that each customer receives. Remember, we have hundreds of surveillance cameras and security and regulators cruising the property. If we observe one of our customers opening that package, we seize that product and it's off to destruction. No ifs, ands, or buts, no appeal process, no return to inventory, nothing. It's destroyed, and our customers know that. Our customers come up to the property and say, this is the most secure facility I've ever been in. The surveillance cameras, the security on property, and we have one-way glass where we can actually observe our customers from the other end. In a tribal regulated environment, the rules are for the tribe to set however they want to set them, and we set them extremely high, as do other tribes in this business. That sign in the middle, that's, this industry is made up of folks, and there again, I shudder to say this as a former narcotics agent, but it's made up of some very altruistic individuals, some very giving individuals. Our non-tribal tenants hold fundraisers for the schools, community groups. We're actually sending a group of middle schoolers off to space camp this summer based on fundraisers held at our facility, just among the tenants, not involving kids, but just among the tenants. It's a very altruistic industry. Fines and penalties. So the regulations come, of course, with a disciplinary process, and we enforce our regulations to the T. All the fines that we collect, none of it goes to the regulatory agency. None of it goes to buy new computers or surveillance cameras or the things that we need. No, that's paid for through the licensing fees that we charge those tenants. All those fines and penalties go to the tribe's general fund for a line item, drug prevention, education, and youth skill building activity. And there's some pretty substantial fines. It's a pretty good sized fund. And it goes right back into the community for the community's benefit. Those are the regulations you find in a tribal regulated environment. This is our dispensary, Mountain Source Dispensary. Wide array of product, all laboratory tested. I should say that Santa Isabel, as a few other tribes in California, we actually predate the state in enacting mandatory laboratory testing regs, pesticide regulations, environmental protection, as well as water conservation, waste handling procedures. So we're one of the only companies, or one of the only governments in the state where our waste, by regulation, everything has to be rendered unrecoverable, unusable as a controlled substance. We actually hired as a property management company, a business that has a 100% organic process to decompose all cannabis-containing waste. And the byproduct are about 6 different products, none of which contain cannabis, all marketable. So we've actually created an ancillary revenue stream for the tribe involving the byproducts of cannabis where none of the residuals are cannabis containing. Fertilizer, mulch, pet food. Great businesses. That's how tribes think. That's the information that we have to share with the state if they would only engage. If they would only engage. An example of our product offering, I will tell you that our laboratory standards are more stringent than the state. All you need to do is compare the certificate of analysis that accompanies each one of our products with the certificate of analysis at state licensed dispensaries to tell the difference. Ours are an average 2 pages long. We have a full spectrum analysis that's required of every product, and it's available on demand by consumers that come through the front door. We require laboratory testing of everything before it's allowed to leave the reservation for other tribal destinations, or if it's sold here. One of the processes that we built that the state of California still doesn't have is the ability to track that finished product all the way back to its source plant. Many of the state licensed retailers, they drop off tracking that after the laboratory analysis is complete. I will tell you from our experience, consumers come back in and they say, bad product. They'll say, not good. And most retailers, state licensed retailers, I venture to say, would say, no problem. Do you want a refund, or would you like some more product? And they'll make it right with the customer. Well, what happens to that product that was returned? Is it cleaned up in the back room, put back on the shelf, or just thrown away as waste? Well, we have regulations that require that any time a customer returns product, the regulatory agency has to be notified. We immediately respond. We take custody. We physically examine. If necessary, we send that product off for laboratory testing. We want to know what's bad with that product. And in the meantime, while that product's being tested or evaluated by us, because of the coding on each product that we sell, we're able to quarantine an entire lot of products made from the same source material. And it's put on hold. It's not allowed to be sold until we have those laboratory results. And the laboratory results confirm that it's bad for whatever reason, everything goes to waste. Tell me that happens in a state-regulated environment. I venture to say not. We have this experience, we have this knowledge, we have these procedures that we'd like to share. And the incentive is, frankly, our tenants, our non-tribal tenants, want to participate in that California market. We're producing way more inventory than the tribal market will support currently. We want to be able to supply laboratory tested, quality, regulated product in the California market. And oh, by the way, all the sales, all the taxes, and Mark alluded to the taxes, all the taxes, county taxes, city taxes, state taxes, in that market, they're the city, the county, the states to do with what they will. The tribe will make its money before that product leaves Santa Isabel and enters that California market. But at our dispensary, we are not charging any county taxes. We're not charging any state taxes. So imagine this, and this may replicate itself 35 or possibly even 109 times throughout the state of California. You have all these retail businesses set up on tribal lands where right away the consumer saves, 18, 20%, whatever the state tax is at a time. So we're able to sell that product at a much lower cost. And oh, by the way, based on our laboratory analysis, it's a much better product. Much better product. I think the consumer will make their trip out to the reservation. What do you think? The regulatory agency, we do suitability backgrounds and licenses of business entities, investors, individual employees, every single employee. We use the same metric that we used as a gaming commission in conducting those suitability backgrounds. Why that's instructive? We've had applicants who were licensed by the County of San Diego to work in county licensed retailers when the county had a medical ordinance that applied to work at our facility at Santa Isabel, and they couldn't pass the background. I know how stringent our licensing criteria is. It's as stringent, if not more so, than what other governments throughout California are applying, be they city, counties, or the state. Now, I mentioned San Diego County had an ordinance. They revoked it. They don't have an ordinance any longer. Section 5009 of the Bureau's regulations, the section that covers tribal participation, it's untenable as currently written. For one thing, that limited waiver of sovereign immunity should not apply to a non-tribal business entity operating on tribal lands. They're not a sovereign government. They ought not be required to submit a limited waiver of sovereign immunity. I'm guessing that those regulations were composed without any consultation from tribal governments. But the other thing is, the state requires, oh, by the way, we're not considered local jurisdiction, so that reference to local jurisdiction in statute does not apply to tribal communities. So you got a tribal community that approves of legal regulated cannabis activity on tribal lands, but yet the state won't recognize that approval as local jurisdiction approval. No, we have to have approval from the County of San Diego, which is ludicrous. If you ask the County of San Diego, why would we approve what you're doing on your sovereign lands? Our county gets it. But here, to take it one step further, so Section 5009 requires the County of San Diego to prove what we're doing at Santa Isabel, right? Now, the County of San Diego rescinded their cannabis ordinance. They decided we do not want cannabis enterprise activity to occur in the unincorporated parts of the county. But here's the deal. You have state licensed dispensaries in the city of San Diego that's within the County of San Diego, and those delivery services operating from the city of San Diego are delivering in the unincorporated parts of the county. Do you know that when the County of San Diego rescinded its cannabis ordinance, Chairman for the Ipe Nation of Santa Isabel sent the Board of Supervisors a letter the very next day stating, we will not allow any cannabis products generated from Santa Isabel to go into any location within the unincorporated parts of the county. We will totally respect your sovereign decision as a county not to allow this activity to exist within your county. But yet you have state licensed retailers in municipal locations within County of San Diego delivering to the unincorporated parts of the county. Our local county board of supervisors said, why is that so? Why is that allowed to happen? Our regulations start, I think, at 87 pages. When we started, we used gaming as an example. I asked our local U.S. attorney, because we met with all of the relevant government stakeholders before we allowed a single plant on property. And I asked the Assistant U.S. Attorney for Southern District of California at the time, should we use California's guidelines as an example? Keep in mind, it was all 11362, and then there was an opinion from Attorney General Locklear on regulating medicinal cannabis. He said, absolutely not. They're totally atrocious. Start with a blank page. I said, well, we won't do that. We'll start with our gaming regulations, and we'll take best practices from Washington, Oregon, Colorado, other jurisdictions where it's happened. That was the genesis for our regulations initially. We're now in excess of 200 pages. Those 200 pages are born of experience of doing this day in and day out for the past 4 years. We have a lot of experience regulating in this space. We require seed-to-sale tracking systems. We require POS systems. We require independent audits. And I heard that mentioned at the subcommittee meeting on social equity yesterday. Why are we do audits on every? In fact, the regulatory agency requires audits, independent audits, of the 2 tribal-owned businesses that we have operating at our facility, both the dispensary and the edibles company, because I need to be able to represent track every single dollar that goes through, because I'm responsible to tribal council. I don't work for the dispensary, I don't work for the facility, I work for my tribal council. And we're accountable. And we have the only, in the United States, the only required minimum internal control audits of a regulatory agency in cannabis anywhere. And that comes right out of gaming. If you're familiar with gaming, mix audits, state of the art. Nowhere does it exist in cannabis, because I want to be able to have an independent agency come in, take a look at what we do as a regulatory agency and says, yes, you are doing your job as regulators in ensuring consumer safety, in ensuring the safety and security of the employees, the security of tribal assets, and the accountability of all things cannabis. Live monitored surveillance, I mentioned that. All of our security officers are Bureau of Security Investigative Services, California Department of Consumer Affairs certified. We actually have, I think, one of the few cannabis commissioner, cannabis regular trainings. We hold those for other tribes throughout California. They'll send their regulators to Santa Isabel for 3 days worth of training, very comprehensive training in regulating in this space. We have an 8-hour certification course for all of our retail staff before they're allowed to work in the dispensary. That's administered by the regulatory agency. Cannabis waste disposal, I mentioned. Our transportation protocols are much more stringent than what the state requires. We guarantee, I had to guarantee to our sheriff that when cannabis left Santa Isabel, we could absolutely guarantee the destination, that it's going to get there in the integrity way it left, and all the parts are going to be there. So we have a very stringent transportation process. I mentioned the audits, inspections, audits, checklists. I mean, we're on property every single day. And ask any of our tenants. We're checking everything when it comes to cannabis. And that's what ensures the quality control. That's what ensures the safety. Emergency response procedures, a security manual, surveillance manual, facilities operations manual. We killed a lot of trees to create the infrastructure that we have. No different than what's happening on other tribal reservations related to cannabis economic development. This is our emphasis, short and sweet. We have the same goals that the state of California has in regulating this industry in state-regulated enterprises, the exact same goals. Our membership, our community members, have the same passion for safety, security, consumer protection, accountability than every other citizen of California. Our facility, once again. And you can see the defensible position. In 4 years of operation, not one single call for police services. Not one single call for tribal police, the local sheriff's department. We have plenty of officers that come up, thank goodness, because we have an open door policy. Sheriff's deputies, CHP, Border Patrol, they're coming up there, taking selfies with the plants. But not for public safety reasons. Not one. Not one medical emergency. Not one.
Thanks. So at this point, the state of the tribal market in California is, tribes can't interface with the state market at all. So tribes are left to what Dave was describing, developing our own programs and trading among tribes, and doing so, hopefully, in compliance with regulatory standards that meet what Dave just let out. But there's a lot of tribes out there, and not all tribes are going to do it exactly the same. So there's going to be a difference in terms of what tribes are going to require in terms of testing or what they're not. And obviously none of the tribes are going to be charging state taxes for anything that they're cultivating or selling on tribal lands. So I spent a lot of time with one of the authors of Prop 64, and the way he used to talk about it was that, if you don't address the tribal situation in California, you're actually not going to fulfill the purposes of Prop 64, because you're going to leave these large gaps all over the state where there's going to be inconsistent regulations. As we described before, we came to the state in good faith to try to negotiate what we thought was a fair and equitable agreement for how to address this. We modeled it after what was already working in other states, and some tribes from behind us told us we were giving away too much. We shouldn't agree to pay the same taxes as that. We shouldn't agree to charge the same level of taxes as the state. We should keep an economic advantage. Why give them that? They said to us. Well, because otherwise we're going to get opposition from groups like CCIA and groups like that. They're going to feel like we're undercutting the market, and what did we used to hear? Marlboro is going to, the big boy, J.R. Reynolds is going to come in and open up, massive cultivation on tribal lands, and it's going to take over the entire state market. Everybody was afraid of that, right? And those were the perceptions we were dealing with in the beginning when we were trying to work on this bill together. We got opposition, quiet, subtle opposition, probably from some of the large gaming tribes. They weren't sure, should tribes be public about this, about going into cannabis? Do we want tribes out there negotiating with labor unions over terms for how labor unions can organize on tribal lands? That's been a big issue in Indian country. But the tribes that formed Sinaka came together and said, we're going to go through the front door on this. There's a long history of disputes between Indian country and state governments. There's a trajectory that these kinds of disputes take. If you look at the history of fuel, alcohol, tobacco, gaming, all these things, they followed a similar trajectory. And we went to the state legislature, we went to the governor's office, we went to all the stakeholders, and we said, let's bypass that standard trajectory where the tribes just go ahead and do it, and then the state tries to litigate to say, no, the taxes are ours, or we should have enforcement authority, and we end up in federal court for years fighting each other, and then eventually we figure out some way to make a deal, and we have a compact or some kind of agreement where we figure out a way forward as governments that respect each other. We went to the state legislatures, we sat in legislators' offices and committees' offices and the governor's office, and we said, look, we have really pro-tribal sovereign government here, don't we, in California? Can't we bypass those years of going at each other over these issues and just come to the good agreement at the end that we want for how we share this? For how tribes, the state recognizes the tribe's sovereignty and the tribe's jurisdiction to do what they can do on the reservation and still have a productive, healthy market interfacing with the states? Apparently not. We couldn't get it done that way. So we just came out of a meeting with the Sinaka tribes, and the emphasis there, I can report to you, is right now to create a healthy nation-to-nation market, tribe-to-tribe market, where the tribes will trade among themselves, and the tribes will provide, hopefully a baseline of regulatory standards among themselves, and they will sell to each other, and we will open up dispensaries on tribal lands all over the state, and we will not be charging state taxes. And we say that to you today, not because we're trying to, be alarmist about this or whatever for the industry in California, but this is the logical result of what's happened over the last 3 years. If you keep telling the tribes, we'll deal with you next year when we have time. We'll deal with you next year when we have more time. We'll deal with you next year when we have more time. This is the inevitable result of that approach by the state of California. And I fully recognize that this advisory committee has a limited amount of authority over all those different aspects of state policy that we're talking about. But you asked to hear from us. This is the truth of where the tribes are right now. This is what we have to tell you as the state's advisory committee on these issues. This is what you can go and report back. This is what's happening in Indian country in California in cannabis.
And Mark's going to kick me under the table, I promise you when I say this. Not all tribes are the same. At San Isabel, we have 4 non-tribal tenants who are in process, some for over a year now, for licensure with the state of California. In an effort to support our non-tribal tenants, as a regulatory agency and my chairman, as the leader of the tribe, have sent correspondence to the Bureau saying, look, We understand. You need to have confidence that the folks that you license, whether on tribal lands or off tribal lands, are adhering to state regulations. So here's the deal. We're going to give you 100% unfettered access to your licensees on our tribal lands. One step further, we're going to take our regulatory agency and enforce your standards, state of California standards, utilizing our resources, our manpower, which I already know is 24/7, on your licensees on our tribal lands. In fact, if you take regulatory action, I can pretty much guarantee you that so will we. We'll take regulatory action without a whole lot of evidence from you. If folks are doing things wrong in your estimate in violating regulations, they're violating tribal regulations as well. Best of both worlds. Sent correspondence to the chief. Zero response. No response. That's the lack of engagement. That's the frustration. So our request of you, and Mark said it very well, we recognize that your authority, your power is limited, but please encourage the state government to engage with tribes on a mutually respectful government-to-government basis now that you understand tribal sovereignty and the role of tribal governments, because at the end of the day, we're all after the same thing, right? Encourage state government to engage with tribes, whether it's through SENACA or the Tribal Chairmen's Association or whatever channel the state chooses, engage with tribes. And second, encourage state regulators to come talk to us. We've got stories to tell. We can share lessons, best practices. Works in gaming. I know it works in. I know it'll work in cannabis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Villapando. Is that better?
Sir. Yes, sir. Very good.
There you go, Mr. Levitan. So at this point, this was an informational presentation, so we're not going to be able to take action because it wasn't tabled that way. But I do think it's good to allow our committee and then ultimately the public make some comment and ask our people can make ask some questions. So are you available to answer questions to the committee?
Sure.
Are you willing
Certainly.
to? Very good. Okay, thank you. With that, I'd like to open up for questions from the committee. If anybody have any questions for these presenters?
Yes. We live in a society where there are disproportionate impacts depending upon who we are in the society. Part of the disproportionate impacts give rise to social equity programs that we are grappling with today. In some ways, Native American tribes have also been disproportionately impacted. So I guess one of the questions is, in what ways can we mutually collaborate to break down, I'll use the metaphor of the wall. How do we break down the wall? Because you indicated that the committee has limited authority, but we certainly have authority to make recommendations. We can't make recommendations today, but we have the authority at least to make recommendations. And so how would you request the optimal way to do that?
Go
ahead first.
A very perceptive observation on your part, Mr. Sweetie, and thank you for the question. So I was present yesterday for the subcommittee meeting on social equity. I've been present at the legislature for discussions regarding social equity. Tribal communities across the state with high rates of unemployment, with limited opportunities on tribal lands, with an overrepresentation by their membership in the criminal justice system as a result of drug law enforcement, fit the definition of impacted communities with regard to social equity programs, but nowhere in recent state legislature, and certainly of the $10 million allocated by the state for social equity programs, is any of that allocated to tribal nations. In fact, save one woman yesterday at the subcommittee hearing, and that came from public comment, there was absolutely no mention of tribal communities as it pertains to social equity programs. So your comment is very appropriate. I will tell you that when it comes to cannabis revenues, and not to disparage gaming tribes in any way, shape, or form, but unlike gaming that has per capita distribution of funds, revenues to membership, most tribes, including Santa Isabel, are actually utilizing the revenues from legal cannabis for community infrastructure, government infrastructure, programs, senior citizen programs, youth programs, employment skill building. It's allocated by statute to go to those areas. And CNACA as a group will entertain a proposal of a tribal social equity program, because we're not going to be able to count on the state to help us out. So utilizing revenues from legal cannabis, and there again, if tribes are able to participate in the California cannabis market, not only does the state gain revenue from that, but the tribes do as well. Sure. And we're able to use those revenues for social equity programs within our impacted tribal communities. So, like I said, encouraging the state to engage, to provide a pathway, a workable pathway, a tenable pathway for tribal participation is the best that we can hope for. Thank you.
I would just add to that, thank you for your question as well. You know, we had some discouraging experiences in Sacramento on this issue, I'll share with you. You know, we were not invited, tribes were not invited to those committee hearings that had to do with bills that were addressing those issues and the allocation of those funds. And when we showed up at those hearings to give a tribal perspective, the tribal leadership was, you know, you'd see somebody from a local community group stand up to talk from Oakland, and they'd be, you know, given, you know, it was a 1-minute limit, and they'd talk for 7 minutes, and the chair wouldn't cut them off. And then the chair of a tribe would stand up to talk, and they'd be cut off at 60 seconds. You know, that was the tribe's experience dealing with those issues, that they were not seen as belonging in that group, and they walked out of those hearings feeling very excluded from those considerations. To your question and I'm sorry, I also just want to emphasize what Dave was saying. The most rural communities in California are where a lot of these tribes and 109 tribes are located. And these are the areas of California that have the highest rates of unemployment and the highest poverty rates, and, you know, serious, you know, drug and alcohol abuse issues, and issues that the sheriff's deputies have to deal with on a daily basis. Bringing cultivations, tribal cultivation operations to those remote communities is good policy for the state of California.
Yes.
Giving jobs in those local communities. A lot of those tribal communities are relatively small, and they'll employ 50% or more non-Indian employees in their cultivation facilities. That's happening right now. And that's bringing economic benefits to these rural communities right now. And, you know, we tried to tell the state of California that in these discussions over taxation and regulation, and it fell on deaf ears. So our request to you in terms of the recommendations you could make would be to, both with regard to the governor's office and with regard to the committees of the state legislature that handle cannabis issues and tribal issues, that your recommendation is that negotiations with tribal governments take place, consultations take place, and that we find a way to agree on a cooperative way forward with regard to tribal cannabis and participation in the state market. Thank you.
Yeah, that reminds you of one thing. You're about to drop your water, dude.
Thank you.
I just don't want you to get wet. It reminded me of one thing. So at Santa Isabel, one of the things that impressed our local board of supervisors when she came out to visit is we're employing at our facility between 120 and 130 folks. Doesn't sound like a lot, but in a rural area like East San Diego County, it's substantial. We're employing as many folks at our facility, we call it the Santa Isabel Botanical Facility, as we were when it was a full-on casino. And those employees are local residents. They're tribal community members, not only from Santa Isabel, from La Jolla, from San Pasqual, from Rincon, from our surrounding communities as well. So tremendous benefit. And that's how we level the playing field on social equity.
So just a reminder to the committee, could you please announce your name so the court reporter has ours? Public does not have that requirement, but for our purposes, it's good for you to announce your name when you're asking. So the last question was made by?
James Sweeney.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. This
Name?
is Bill Bullion. Following up on Dr. Sweeney's question, the equity programs that you would create on tribal land, how would that, for the sake of argument, benefit social equity programs in LA, for instance? The social equity programs that would be created on tribal land, how would that benefit the social equity programs, for instance, like the city of LA?
Well, I think ultimately the interaction between tribes and the state regulated market, if we had an AB 924 model or something like it in operation, then the way the system would work is anything that happens on the reservation, the tribes would keep the taxation dollars. But anything that happens off the reservation, the state would keep the taxation dollars. So if you have cultivation operations in state on tribal lands, most of the dispensaries that they would be trading with and distributors and testing facilities would be located off tribal lands if they were able to freely participate in the state market. So they would be paying into those equity funds, participating in them. The question that you're asking, though, is more specific than that sort of that general contributing to the fund if the states were allowed to participate in the market. And honestly, it's a great question. It's one that I think the tribes would be happy to explore as to what kind of interface there could be to improve that relationship with what's happening in the inner cities versus the rural areas of California in the tribal minority communities.
Okay, so if we were to segment that out and say cultivation gets outsourced to tribal land, and because the cultivation, the flower being produced on tribal land gets traded with dispensaries licensed under the BCC and city markets, for example, like City of LA, what happens to the jobs and the license holders and the businesses involved in cultivation in the state? LA, Humboldt, any of those? Because by your presentation, you said that CCI was initially going to oppose it because if they started allowing for tribal lands to cultivate without participating in the tax collection, without paying the state of California taxes, you lose the license holders, you lose the jobs, you lose basically an entire segment of the industry to tribal land. How would that be different than outsourcing it out and contracting out with the big corporation, Marlboro?
Well, I think what we're here to say is that's going to happen anyway. I mean, the tribes are going to participate in the cannabis market of the state of California, whether they interface with the state legal program or not. And we can try to set up barriers against each other and charge each other tariffs and things like that, I suppose. Or we can figure out a way to work together. But the tribes were here first. They're not going to go anywhere.
Great. No, look, I completely agree. And with the tribal stuff, tribes were definitely disproportionately impacted. Tribes do need to participate in this industry, and I think there's a fine balance and there's a fine line. But one of the issues that comes up is when you're dealing with government-to-government relationships, which tribal and California would be, it's kind of the equivalent of Nevada negotiating with California, saying, hey, we've already got an existing industry, we've got license holders, we've got ridiculous regulations, we've got a built-out marketplace with operators that know what they're doing. Why don't you forget about your market, outsource that out to us, let us grow it in Nevada, and then ship it out to California, and whatever benefits you receive in California by accepting it from us, you'd be able to fund your own program. So I think the trade-off would be one agency has to be the lead agency. And if the tribes are participating in the California's market and California has a bureau as the full thing, we're doing this whole rollout, it's been a year and a half, 2 years, wouldn't it be a lot more streamlined if the tribal authority falls underneath the BC authority, which from my understanding that was already offered up, but to be able to participate in the California marketplace, not have to pay the taxes, that becomes no different than dispensary not paying taxes in the unregulated California market. So if you had a dispensary on tribal land that's not collecting local taxes, that's not paying state taxes, how is that different than an unlicensed shop in Long Beach, for instance, competing with a licensed shop on the other side of LA that is paying those taxes?
Yeah, I think we have a model that's not very successful that you suggest, with all due respect, the gaming model. In gaming, under the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act administered by the National Indian Gaming Commission, tribes have primary responsibility for regulation of gaming on tribal lands. And it's because they're there. It's because they're better suited. It's because they're more qualified to conduct that than the state of California, which in the case of the Bureau of Gambling controls less than 300 agents to cover 65 tribal casinos and 85 card rooms throughout the state of California. It's just not tenable to depend on the state of California to regulate completely cannabis operations on tribal lands, just from a resource perspective. It just makes better sense on a respectful government term where you have tribal cannabis regulations that are as robust, as stringent as what state regulations require, to utilize those resources that are already on tribal lands and to give deference to tribes as sovereign governments to regulate on their tribal lands. It's done in gaming, works really well. If you take a look at the public safety issues in gaming, where they don't occur is on tribal lands. Where they do occur is in state-regulated card rooms.
Right,
I can tell you from experience.
Right, but gaming is also not an appropriate parallel to cultivation because gaming is a destination business. Oh, I'm sorry. Gaming and cultivation are not directly comparable because gaming is a destination business. If I want to go play poker or blackjack, I have to drive to that location, I have to drive to that casino. You would be able to compare gaming to dispensaries because they are both destinations. But with cultivation, it's a little bit more difficult to draw a parallel. But I guess my biggest issue with all this would be the jobs, the license holders.
Yeah, we had these conversations actually in the middle of our dealings in AB 924 for 9 months, and those same concerns were raised by CCIA and the Cow Growers Association, CGA, and frankly, related issues were raised by the unions, UFCW. At the end of our discussions, all three of those organizations were in support of AB 924.
The Teamsters was in support.
Sorry.
UFCW kind of sat it out. But I think the other answer to your question is basically tribal sovereignty, which is not based on a model of economics efficiency or even regulatory efficiency. These are historic sovereigns, and they're going to be acknowledged and treated as such. And the state of California can decide to do that voluntarily through a process of negotiations, or we can come to those conclusions through federal court decisions. But either way, they are sovereigns. So to go back to, and I had this debate with a staff person in Sacramento over and over again. Well, it wouldn't be efficient for tribes to be regulating this on tribal lands. Why wouldn't you be part of the state system? It's just not efficient. Well, I'm sorry, I guess to me, having worked with tribes for 20 plus years, efficiency isn't the end of the game for me.
Thank you.
Any other? Oh, yes, please.
Member Nikita here. Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. It was very informative. And by all accounts, very impressive facility you have. Question. This is just a general question on how the tribes interface with state regulation, generally speaking. If you had, I don't know, this is not a perfect analogy, and I don't know if this exists, but if you have, let's say, a bakery on tribal land and you're baking food products, you can ship those into the state territory and sell those at retail?
That there, the analogy of state to state actually is where it would come in. You'd be subject to the same regulations that a baker in Reno would be subject to that was shipping into the state of California.
So the production of the product is subject to the rules that the tribe sets, but the retail of it in the state of California, jurisdiction area, is subject to the food code, retail food code.
Exactly.
So on this issue, if you're producing edibles or flour and you're shipping it into the California market and you're selling it, I'm not familiar with the details of the legislation that was described, but you would be willing to label it per the California rules, test it per the California rules, and
One of my regrets of when I was going through what I hadn't covered in the presentation was that in the description of AB 924, we should have given you more information about what it included. And AB 924 was comprehensive in terms of requiring tribal governments to track the substantive regulations of the state of California with regard to all of those kinds of issues. That's what the tribes were offering to agree to in order to interface with the state market.
so from the consumer side,
That's a lawyer's answer. The short answer is anything that enters the California stream of commerce from a tribal reservation will match state regulations. In fact, if our non-tribal entities at San Isabel are able to become state licensed, anything that leaves the reservation has to leave in a form that's complies with state regulations. Once it gets to that dispensary, it has to continue to meet state regulations, and it's subject to inspection by state regulators. But let me give you an honest-to-goodness example, and thanks for reminding me. About a year and a half ago, we had a tenant who was actually supplying finished cannabis product to a dispensary in Southern California in San Diego County. And this was a state license, one of the very first state licensed dispensaries. And a state BCC inspector came in, regulator came in, and began pointing out to the retailer all of the product within their display case that did not meet state regulations with regard to childproofing, labeling, ingredients, did not meet. He reached in and he picked up one product. Now, it doesn't say made in San Isabel. It had our tenant's name on it, that company's name, but he held it up. He says, now this product meets all the requirements the state of California has for packaging, for labeling, for childproofing. All this product here should look just like this. And it was the only product in the display case that made state regulations. And at that time, as is now, we had no interface with the state of California from San Isabel. Our regulations mirror in many respects, and in some respects they're more stringent than what the state of California requires. And so are other tribes involved in this market. There's no desire by tribes, any tribe, to say, well, let me create substandard regulations in order to get my product in the market. It's all about consumer safety. It's all about consumer protection.
so with the legislation, essentially, I mean, I understand your facility has certain regulations, but we're talking about all tribes could participate with that legislation. You're saying from the consumer side, they wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a state licensed product and a product developed within a tribe, other than perhaps made in wherever. It's the same.
That's right.
Yes,
Okay.
if entering the California stream of commerce, absolutely. You can totally tell the difference if you come up to Mountain Source Dispensary because you're on tribal lands. By the way, before I forget, all of you are invited to come up anytime you like. Please, you have my contact info. Make sure one of us or regulators are there. We'd be glad to give you the full-on tour.
Mr. Sweeney?
Yes, one of the things that has crossed my mind is that it might be possible to not try to get into all of the particulars if we look at the general model of the necessity for talks, government to government, sovereign to sovereign. And then also there are aspects of behavior and disparate treatment that I think reflect multiple minorities who have had various situations. And I believe if we talked about possible government-to-government conversations that were fueled by what I would call multi-minority consciousness, then there might be the ability to bridge this gap. And secondly, time has gone by. And thirdly, you have the Bonta legislation as a guide. And finally, you did come to some agreement earlier from some of the advocates who were able to see the viability. I want to support our Cannabis Advisory Committee, and particularly I want to support the advocacy of the only Native American who sits on this body, who was a major voice to have you come before us today. Because there is every reason why these conversations need to go forward. And so in my opinion, I think we are under the constraints of not being able to make a recommendation today. But it might be, who knows, it might be in the offing to put an ad hoc subcommittee together to explore the benefits, the bilateral benefits of government-to-government activity. So there are a number of things that can happen. And then I would also finally like to say, I personally, I cannot say this as a Cannabis Advisory Committee member, but I personally would love to come and take the tour in the interest of multi-minority consciousness. I would take the tour with Alice Hoffman. I would take the tour with several other people, because I believe it has inherent viability.
Thank you, sir.
Any other comments by the committee?
I had a question, yeah. Sure. First of all, I want the tour too, so I want to get in on that. And I also would like to thank you guys for coming for the presentation. It was really informative and useful. And I have two quick questions. One is just a follow-up on the bakery question. That's, I think, just understanding the basic law. If we came to a point where interstate commerce was allowed, is the special compact or agreement needed between the state and the tribal groups, or is at that point it becomes state to state automatically? If you're a 280 state, that sort of interstate law would govern, so it would be the same as coming in from Nevada.
Let me try to answer the question by coming at it from a slightly different angle.
Okay.
Tribes are not subject to state regulation. They're not subject to state statutes. So the idea of AB 924 was to delegate the authority to the governor to negotiate agreements, government-to-government agreements, by which a tribal government can agree that it's going to meet standards, can agree that if it interfaces with the state licensees, that any product that it sends to that state licensee is going to meet the same standards, have the same license background checks of the people who were involved, all those kinds of parameters, the testing, everything that's happened with regard to that product. That model of agreement is critical, so that it's not a top-down state of California saying to the tribes, this is what you have to do, which is the unfortunate reality in the regulations right now, is the only option for tribes to interface with the state model at all is through a regulation that doesn't provide for an agreement. It provides for an avenue for a tribal entity or a non-entity on tribal land to waive immunity and subject itself completely to state jurisdiction. So what we're looking for are avenues for government-to-government agreement which is the model that gaming provides as well, right? Is the negotiation of the compacts. Now, what happened between the second and the third year of the proposed BONTA legislation is the first 2 years, the legislation was very simple, which was what Oregon, Washington, and Nevada did. It just simply said, it was like a page and a half. The legislature is going to delegate this authority to the governor. Well, when that didn't pass in California the second year, what the CNACA team was advised by the stakeholders, be it labor unions, rural counties, groups that really came out strongly opposed to the legislation, was that's not going to work here in California. We don't want to give the governor such broad authority to enter into any kind of agreement with the tribes on this that they want. So you, CNACA, you're going to have to come back to the legislature with a bill that looks more like the endpoint agreement, that provides a lot more specificity as to what the tribes are willing to agree to. So that's what you see in the end result of AB 924. So it's the parameters of the agreement are much more specifically defined than they are in those other states.
Okay.
Does that help?
And just then one quick additional question. In the state, so a number of states, there have been agreements reached, like Washington State, the governor
Yes.
can negotiate agreements, and Oregon as well.
And Nevada.
And Nevada.
Yeah.
Have any of those states, as part of the agreements, attempted to grapple with the issue of the overall amount of cultivation within the state, and how much can be cultivated, how much cultivation can be provided by the tribal groups? Because having the two separate sovereignties governing it, one challenge to me would seem to be if a state is going to attempt to manage with an intra-state system as we have right now, the total amount that's cultivated within the state, is that something that's negotiated, or is that left open in those agreements within other states?
It's left open, but it is tracked. So there is information sharing, so the state is aware of what's coming off of tribal lands, and that was part of what was offered in AB 924, was that the tribes would voluntarily, through the agreement, participate in the state track and trace system.
Just really quickly for the committee members, just a quick legal point. I know everyone seems to be very interested in a tour, but keep in mind that all the Bagley-Keene requirements would still be applicable, including the serial meetings if we were to do them separately. So just a little point of clarification for you there.
We'll go one at a
Tell them they
time.
couldn't take product out.
But it's still a serial. Unfortunately, so we had two volunteer, there you are.
Mr. Chairman?
We're limited to that. Thank you for your, we have, hi.
I just want to make a
State your
comment, and I want to thank David, Levon Peck.
Thank you.
I would like to thank Dave and Mark for coming. I'm hoping that your presentation enlightened everyone in the room to understand the struggles that the tribes are having. It's difficult to see an industry that we can't participate in. So I don't want to make this, I think we need to get along with the state. I think there's a way, there's an avenue, and I appreciate, and I hope everybody is enlightened by your presentation and that there's going to be a path forward for the tribes. Thank you.
Thank you.
And gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. I'm going to ask one question that really doesn't go to this because you've made it clear you're a sovereign nation. The state of California doesn't have any oversight. But the federal government, I think, does. And we currently still operate in a really kind of interesting spot. And if there wasn't federal legislation that said that states that have a robust enforcement process, there can be no DEA or DOJ enforcement. And I don't know in that legislation whether tribal nations are protected by that. So how would you, if you were to start to operate in this system, what concerns would you have for your tribal lands with the federal government still having a significant say in what happens on tribal lands, I think?
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot. I'm glad that it came up. Federal law preempts state law, and federal law preempts tribal law. So the tribes in the state of California aren't actually on any kind of different footing vis-a-vis federal law. The issue really is the individual discretion of the U.S. Attorney's offices and what they consider to be an enforcement priority or not an enforcement priority. And I've accompanied several tribal governments in meetings with assistant U.S. attorneys, and we've presented ordinances and regulations and plans for tribal cannabis programs. And we've been advised that this is a violation of federal law, and they smile and shake our hands. The point is, you know, there is no permit process for states or tribes vis-a-vis exemptions from federal law. The Rohrabacher-Blumenauer Amendment exempts the state's medical program. It doesn't exempt the state's adult use program right now. Last week, the United States House of Representatives voted to extend Rohrabacher-Blumenauer to states with adult use programs. It also voted to extend Rohrabacher-Blumenauer protection to all tribal governments with legal programs. We're hopeful that that legislation, both for the state's protection on the adult use side, will get through the Senate, and for the tribe's protection, will get through the Senate side. In the meantime, though, you know, the robust regulatory schemes that Dave spent a good amount of time going through for you are the same reasons why the U.S. Attorney won't come after tribes and why they won't come after the state of California.
Yeah, our experience 4 years ago at San Isabel, I mentioned that we met with all of the interested stakeholders. There were about 30 folks in the room. It was hosted at the U.S. Attorney's office in downtown San Diego. We met with the U.S. Attorney and her staff, with the district attorney, with the sheriff, with state representatives in the room, before we allowed a single plant on property, not to seek their permission, but rather to educate them with regard to what we intended to do. We provided them with our tribal law, tribal ordinance, and our regulations. And of course, the beginning of the meeting was first the U.S. Attorney, Laura Duffy, and then the District Attorney, Bonnie Dumanis, who I've known for years and years and years, a long list of concerns. We addressed every single one of their concerns from a public safety standpoint, to the point that at the end of the 3.5-hour meeting, they both came up and said, absolutely tremendous job. We have a letter from the United States Attorney, Southern District of California. It said, just as a reminder, it's a violation of federal law under 21 U.S.C. 841A1, but you guys have crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's, and good luck with your enterprise. And 4 years later, not a single issue with any law enforcement agency, state, local, or fed.
Oh, thank you. Alice?
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate your, Alice Huffman. I appreciate your presentation. I lived through Proposition 1, Proposition 1A, all of the enforcements that went into gaming. I know that there's a solution out there, and I support the solution, whatever it is, although, you know, we may have to get there through, you know, certain ways. But I really raised my microphone to accept Mr. Sweeney's offer to take me out to visit you and your land.
We'd love to have you.
All right, seeing no other mics heated up, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll go into public comment. So you folks will free to have a seat. The public process doesn't allow the public to ask questions. They can make statements based upon your presentation or some of the comments that have been made by the committee. So thank you very much for your presentation.
We'll be by the water cooler if anybody has any questions.
There you go. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are we on live? Thanks. So I'm going to ask Lindsay to announce, that is Lindsay, correct? Yeah. The, how we're going to run the public comment, so.
Hi, good day, everybody. My name is Lindsay. As the chair said, I'm going to be assisting with the public comment process. So it's pretty much similar as to yesterday's subcommittee meetings, but for those that didn't participate yesterday, we are going to have 3 speakers. So you can come up and sit in any open seat or form a line behind the seats if you want to make a public comment. Each public comment each person can make a public comment of 1 minute and 30 seconds. We have a timer on the table here today. It will start at 1 minute 30 seconds, and then it'll move to yellow for a warning that you have 30 seconds left, and then it'll start beeping once your time is up. So I'll move forward and say, go ahead speaker 1, then we'll move to speaker 2, and move to speaker 3, and we'll continue that process until we're done with public comment. If you have any questions about the process, please feel free to come up to me. But for now, we'll open for public comment on item number 3, which was the informational presentation and discussion on tribal participation in the legal cannabis industry. So anybody that would love to make a public comment on item number 3, please come up in an empty seat and then form a line behind them.
Okay, and I remind you, it's on the topic that we just heard the presentation from. There will be a time later in the day to talk about items not on the agenda, and there will be some other agenda items where there will be appropriate time to address those as well. So thank you. Speaker 1 will be right here.
I'm sorry, two other housekeeping items. We do have this meeting webcasted today. PBS has a documentary film crew. Just to let you know, there are cameras and filming here today. And lastly, we have a court reporter, so please speak slowly and clearly so we can make sure that we have your comments down accurately. Thank you for that, and go ahead, speaker number 1.
Christian Simmons, young entrepreneur trying to get involved in the cannabis industry. A comment on the social equity for the tribal land as far as the, I guess, the concern for moving the product from Indian land to this local dispensary. My comment would be is allow that the taxation to be placed on the dispensaries. It's doing so already. Whether it be they get their cannabis from the Indian tribes or a private party off Indian land, let the taxes be placed on the dispensaries, not the Indian tribal land. That's just something that I see that would be much less complicating for you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, speaker number 2.
Hi, good morning. My name is Arturo Flores. I'm part of the Equity First LA Coalition, dedicated to advocating for the social equity program here in Los Angeles. First and foremost, I would like to invite a lot of you guys to Los Angeles. I know a lot of you guys came from across the state, so I want to take a moment to welcome you here. In regards to item 3, I'd like to say that I was surprised that we haven't already started these conversations with the groups in regards to partnerships, in regards to working together, in regards to sharing best practices, and especially as it pertains to the social equity program. I feel that this partnership can be a strong group as it pertains to social equity, as it pertains to funding, and maybe even having a social equity-centric tax associated with it. And with that being said, what we're seeing is that federally, cannabis is heading towards legalization. So if we're planning for the future and looking ahead, we should start preparing for this declassifying and no longer being a class 1 drug, and start thinking about state-to-state commerce, but ensuring that if we can meet that demand with some of our partners and some of our neighbors here, ensuring that we have those systems and those agreements in place before we consider any other state. So I want to thank Mark and David for coming out and giving us that information.
Thank you. Speaker number 3, please.
My name is Richard Alvarez. I'm here in research with Santa Rosa Indian Tribe. Some of you may know we were at our 11th hour a few years back when the position to take no position allowed the local law enforcement to raid us at right before we were going to send the product to the retail market. This devastated our small community of about 130, 140 people, mostly elderly and little children. To answer your question, sir, this would help the neighboring communities and ours, and those like ours who depend on revenue from casinos and whatnot to become self-sufficient. And where do you think we shop? You know, you are where we go and shop at, the local places, cities around us. Also, I just want you to know that you have a lot more third world situations right here in California than you know, and it is on tribes. Without the revenue from our casinos, it would not be possible to live. This would allow us, obviously, to learn the industry. And who else would you trust, honestly, besides the stewards of the world, of nature, those medicine men and women who got together with the laboratory at our sister San Isabel and discovered a cure to, I'm sorry, but cures in which you're seeking right now.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Speaker number 1, go ahead.
I'm Christina Marsh. I hail from the Great Seal of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Thank you, Dave, for coming and sharing all that information. I've been looking for my group for quite some time. I think it's horrifying that you make people renounce their sovereign rights to be in this space. I know of Native American women in LA who are trying to hide who they are to be in this space. This is our space. We have always been with this plant, and we should be allowed to participate without giving it up, because how do you get rights back when you said take them away? What if you fail? You can't get your rights back? Governments don't give rights back, guys. So you're excluding your first people.
Thank you. Speaker number 2, go ahead.
My name is Jamal Barghouti, and I work for Blackbird. We're a licensed distributor in the state of California as well as the state of Nevada. I've been in the cannabis industry for almost a year now, and what I really love about the cannabis industry is that we have this opportunity to really set a precedence that no other industry has ever. And this may be the last time that we have a major industry that has the opportunity to do that. And I believe that the state of California, being such a huge market, has an important responsibility to honor every community and every person that this plant affects. And I believe that the state of California has an opportunity to set a precedent for how states are interacting with their tribal nations, and that could have further reaching effects as Canada has federally legalized, and who knows how the First Nations are being treated there. And I believe that this can set a precedence as well for interstate commerce, how that is going to play out once things are federally regulated. And I think that it would be remiss for the state to squander that chance.
Thank you very much. Any other speakers on item number 3? Seeing none, we'll close public comment.
So I know I said we wanted to go to lunch immediately following public comment. However, we moved pretty quickly through this. So what I'm proposing, if it's okay with the committee, so we can get some more done, can we go through the first part of number 4 and then break before public comment begins, and then come back from lunch for public comment on item number 4? Do I have any objection? Okay, let's do it. So the chairman for laboratory testing.
That would be me. So, hello, my name is Kristen Nevedal. I was the chairperson for the subcommittee on laboratory testing, which met yesterday. Just kind of a brief overview of what the subcommittee heard. I want to also acknowledge who participated in that subcommittee. So I served as chair. Member Leff, to the right of me here, was also part of that subcommittee, as was Member Williams. And I'm sorry, I'm missing. Oh, I'm sorry, and Member Wu. Yes, thank you all for participating. I know we had some questions about who the subcommittee members were, and getting more information about who we are. So please feel free to look up our bios, which can all be found on the Bureau's website on the Cannabis Advisory Committee page. We had 2 presenters yesterday that brought us some very valuable information, and then we heard from many members of the public. And during the conversations in the subcommittee, I know I strongly felt and wanted to express that this is not my area of expertise, which is what really led us to shape the recommendations that we're going to hear in just a short period. It's really, I think, what led us to shape the recommendations in the manner that we shaped them. So I think without further ado, we could go ahead and have the 2 recommendations read from yesterday.
The first recommendation was to advise the BCC and CDPH to develop statewide chemical standards and advise CDPH to consider CDPH to consider cannabis laboratory capability to go along with standard development, and for these agencies to share their plans with the industry and the committee.
So are there any questions by members of the committee on the recommendation?
This is Member Nikita. Can you just repeat that, please?
Hi, Arnie Leff. I participate in the committee, and I just want to say that the reason this motion got made was because we did hear from a number of laboratories yesterday with regard to difficulty in standards, in that there really were not statewide standards or statewide auditability of the laboratories. And the bottom line is that we, or the government, really needs to assure that the laboratories statewide are accurate, that they have standards that are statewide standards, that some of the issues on testing need to be helped by the state, and we really think it's important that the state get together with the laboratory industry and work out processes and standards that will assure the safety of the commercial cannabis industry in California.
So I'm going to ask Kayla to reread the recommendation that was made.
The recommendation is to advise the BCC and CDPH to develop statewide chemical standards and advise CDPH to consider cannabis laboratory capability to go along with standard development, and for these agencies to share their plans with the industry and the committee.
So again, are there any other comments from the committee?
Just to add on to kind of the heart of the conversation we had yesterday in subcommittee, we heard from a lot of laboratories, and even within the laboratories, you're going to have conflicting ideas and suggestions, right? Because ultimately, some of the bigger labs say there's enough labs out there already, and other labs say there's not enough labs. Some labs are going to say, hey, you only need this type of equipment, and other labs are going to say the testing results provided by that type of equipment isn't good enough, right? So you're hearing lots of different opinions, and I think ultimately, as a subcommittee, we recognize that, look, we are not kind of technocrats. We don't live in labs every day. We don't understand some of the nuances going on in these conversations. So it's really not in our position to just say, this is right, this is wrong. It's tough coming up with the language, but ultimately what we're boiling the recommendation to is saying, BCC, CDPH should really look to, one, set standards, right? But also, California has a lot of experience and a lot of capabilities when it comes to laboratory testing on a variety of other things. And we're saying use your resources to kind of apply it towards cannabis and then come up with what you think the appropriate solution is, and advise us and advise everyone of that before making it formal. I think that's what we're trying to achieve with that language there.
So before I request the recommendation or a motion in support of that, what I thought we could do is then now take the second recommendation, and if we can get it a joint approval, a joint motion to approve them both, that'll help us move through the process a little sooner. So why don't we get the second motion read?
The second motion is BCC in conjunction with CDPH establish a working group including cannabis lab licensees, subject matter experts, and other interested parties to review and develop consistent standards regarding items on the committee agenda.
So do we have any comments on that recommendation?
I'll make a couple comments on that recommendation. So repeatedly throughout the course of yesterday's subcommittee meeting on laboratory testing, we heard from members who participated or the public who participated that there needed to be more working together between licensed laboratories, but also between the laboratories and the licensing authorities. And also, we could use some additional subject matter experts and accreditation bodies to help generate an overall understanding of how to properly test cannabis, how to set up standards, best practices. And so that was really, I think, the driver behind the second motion was there was just again and again repeatedly was this desire to see more working together. And so that's how we got to that motion.
Are there any other committee comments?
Member Nikita, just a clarifying question. So when you say items on the subcommittee agenda, those are the bullet points listed on our agenda as well?
Yes, correct. As a subcommittee, we felt tasked with recommendations as were presented in the agenda, yet they are complex and have some, I would say, layers of depth that were not able to sort through yesterday, and that I think also requires some expertise beyond what we were able to manage yesterday. So it seemed like a good way to make sure that those items didn't go unaddressed was to suggest that a working group could then address them.
So normally we have a complex recommendation that we seek to split from the committee to get approval, but neither of these seemed, at least in my opinion, we couldn't get them merged and into one motion to accept the two recommendations. Is there a motion to accept the two?
Just one little thing on the working group. Again, do keep in mind that if you're envisioning a working group with committee members, that we would be subject to Bagley King.
Right. We did have that conversation yesterday, and we do not envision a working group with committee members.
The working group was really, what we were trying to do is to get the laboratories to collaborate with them, with each other, and to collaborate with the state so that everybody's on the same page with regard to standards, how things are measured, and what things ought to be measured. There's a lot of complexity, especially when we look at cannabis-infused food products and how you test those and how we can get consistency across the laboratory market. Currently, to be very honest, most of the labs that testified yesterday did not feel like they had confidence in statewide standards, because there really aren't any.
Thank you for your comments. So again, do we have anybody who would be willing to make a motion to combine the two recommendations? And
I'll make a motion that we combine the two recommendations and move them forward as currently proposed.
do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. For the first and second, could you clarify your names? And then immediately following that, we'll break for our.
Sure. The first was made by Member Nevedal.
Second from Beverly Yu.
Thank you very much. So when we come back from lunch, we'll take comments from the public. We'll follow the same rules we used for the last public comment period, and then we will tackle the motions. Thank you.
What time are we to be back from lunch?
That's a good thing. Well, I have to see. All right. So why don't we try to be back at 1:40? Yeah. Was that, wait up, no, we don't want to be 1:40. That's a long lunch. Why don't we try to get back at 1 o'clock?
Well, that's 40 minutes. Let's
Yes,
do 40
that's what I'm
minutes.
looking for. Can we do lunch in 40 minutes?
Yeah, we'd be about a CPT factor, about 10 minutes.
So here's what I was just going to say. So we'll push to be back at 1 o'clock. Most of us will be back at 1 o'clock if I can. And if there's some people straggling, we'll try to hold off and find out if. And we can go into public comment.
Yes, so we'll open up for public comment on item number 4, which were the motions for the subcommittee on testing in laboratories. If we could have the motions repeated for the audience, please.
So the testing subcommittee motions are, the first one is advise the BCC and CDPH to develop statewide chemical standards and advise CDPH to consider cannabis laboratory capability to go along with standard development and for these agencies to share their plans with the industry and the committee.
Great, thank you. So the process will be the same. Please take.
I have one more. Sorry.
Sorry.
Okay, Lindsay.
And the second one is BCC, in conjunction with CDPH, establish a working group including cannabis lab licensees, subject matter experts, and other interested parties to review and develop consistent standards regarding items on the Cannabis Advisory Committee agenda.
Thank you. So now we'll move to open public comment. The process is the same. If you'd like to make a comment, please take a seat in the open chair. We'll go from speaker 1, 2, and 3. So at this time, I invite anybody to come up, make a public comment on the motions that were motion for item number 4. All right, I don't see any public comments, so we'll close public comment for item number 4.
Thank you, Lindsay. So with that, let's take the roll.
Babulian?
Aye.
Heidelbeck? Aye. Harada?
Aye.
Huffman? Farrow?
Aye.
Todd?
Aye.
Leff?
Aye.
Nikita? Or I'm sorry, Neptal?
Aye.
Nikita? Aye. Peck? Aye. Stevenson?
Aye.
Sweeney?
Aye.
Williams?
Aye.
Woolsey?
Aye.
Wu? Aye. You?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you, committee, for your good work and all the participation of our public. We'll move to item number 5. That is Beverly Yu, committee member, was the chair. So do you want to open up your committee's work for us?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The delivery subcommittee met yesterday to discuss and adopt recommendations related to cannabis delivery operations. In attendance, we had members Dombrowski, Heidelbeck, Harada, Nikita, Stevenson, and myself. We heard from various perspectives from delivery businesses, local government, representatives, and speakers with personal ties to patient access. As a subcommittee, in our capacity, we adopted recommendations within the existing framework of regulations that we hope will address some of the challenges this part of the industry faces. The first recommendation was to the agenda item on balancing local control with patient access. And we heard from both sides of the issue. Representatives with local government voiced that they have the right under Prop 64 to regulate cannabis delivery, including the ability to ban deliveries within their jurisdiction. Delivery businesses voiced support for delivery freedom to ensure access to safe legal cannabis and to combat the illegal market as promised by Prop 64. We also heard the importance of patients who have limited mobilities, who cannot leave their homes, and use cannabis to improve their quality of life. If the BCC could read out the recommendation that we adopted in the vote.
Would you prefer me to read them one at a time or read them as they are together, all 3 of them?
Maybe one at a time, please.
So the first recommendation is that the subcommittee recommends that the committee support the current regulations on statewide delivery with reasonable parameters of local control.
Thank you. Our second item we looked at was around disclosure of premises address on the delivery receipt. And we heard feedback around public safety concerns to non-storefront retailers that do not have the address available to the public, or it's not, sorry, I meant it's not open to public access. And they have the address on the delivery request receipt. And since businesses operate in a cash economy, this can pose a problem for public safety. So we felt as a subcommittee that would be a good idea to remove the address off the delivery request receipt to increase security.
The second recommendation is that removal of the address from the delivery request receipt for non-storefront retailers, specifically to strike the term address for section 5420A1 of the Bureau regulations.
And the third item we heard was around operating hours for delivery services. The subcommittee heard public comment around the need to clarify the hours for operation, whether the sale would be done at 10 p.m. or the vehicle needed to be back at the shop by then. And there was general consensus around subcommittee members around this issue as well. If you could please read the recommendation.
The recommendation is to support the 10 p.m. cutoff with the active order that the sales transaction must be made before the 10 o'clock cutoff, but allow local jurisdictions to implement reasonable cutoffs.
Thank you.
So is there any comment on any of the three, or let's start with the first one? You want to read just the first one back?
The first recommendation is that the committee support the current regulations on statewide delivery with reasonable parameters of local control.
So is there any committee comment?
What exactly is the current state position on it? Can you deliver into a non?
Tamara? Tamara?
I can read you the regulations.
Thank you.
Okay, the regulation they're talking about, 5416D, says a delivery employee may deliver to any jurisdiction within the state of California, provided that such delivery is conducted in compliance with all delivery provisions of this division.
So would you? So you would be able to deliver into a jurisdiction that has a ban on it?
So I just read the text of the reg for you, and that's about all we can do at this moment. I think.
This member, Nikita, I think the import of that rule is that it would allow any business licensed outside of a jurisdiction to deliver into a jurisdiction regardless of the local rules on that. That is how I understand the rule. That is why there's litigation over that rule. And I think it's I think that I support the local government's position on this one. And so when we go to vote, I request that we bifurcate this particular recommendation from the other two.
And that was the plan, that's why I read it separately, so it'll be on it, stand on its own merit.
If I could just add, as a subcommittee, we felt it was very important for patient access. And we heard concerns from folks that represent local government. In that, we tried to find some middle ground here to allow for local control, but with reasonable limits. So that was kind of our way of trying to bring both sides to reach an agreement on an issue that could be palatable.
Mr. Woolsey?
So,
and could you
Yeah, David Woolsey, member Woolsey.
Thank you.
I have a question on the last half of that recommendation where it talks about reasonable restriction. So does that mean a ban is not a reasonable restriction, but other restrictions are? And would the local jurisdiction still be able to enforce a local regulation? Maybe they're not in violation of a state regulation, but they would still be in violation of a local regulation if someone delivered into an area that prohibited it?
So I read the regulations, you know. Unfortunately, the Bureau can't get into any details of the interpretation of the regulation due to litigation that we're currently involved in. So, you know, the committee can continue to have its discussions, and that is the text of the reg, but we can't provide any interpretation at this time.
Sure, and I'm actually trying to get to the thought behind the subcommittee's recommendation and less the state of the BCC's regulation. So I'm trying to understand where the subcommittee feels that the local reasonable regulation matches the first part of the recommendation that says they can deliver wherever they want.
We were looking, Member Heidelbach, we were looking at, you know, maybe some areas can control the hours of operation. But the idea and some of the things that we discussed were if any area can have alcohol delivered, and if you can have narcotics delivered, and if you can have a burrito delivered, we don't see the difference between that and a pre-roll as long as that business is following the guidelines that the state has given them. And so the whole concept behind our motion was to support what the state currently has, even though we know that there's a pretty hefty argument going on right now around delivery.
And I was trying to understand, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut your mic off, because you did reference patient access, so I didn't know if your thought or the discussion was around the difference between adult use delivery versus, as you know, we had our last chair was in a city where the city had actually opened up delivery specific for access to patients and did not permit it further. So I don't know if that's how your committee talked, or that was the discussion, or if it was more general.
In terms of patient access, if maybe I could just clarify a little here. We discussed it really in the framework of, I would say, medical use, and there was adult use, the component that not all adult use is recreational. And some folks choose to use cannabis for relief with the adult use model. There are folks that spoke about how cannabis helps them relieve pain. It helps them eat, it helps them sleep. And I think the big issue here is there's not enough patient access from what we heard across the state. There are cannabis deserts. There are folks that have to drive many miles to get cannabis. There are folks that have to either grow themselves, which is a really big burden in itself, or they have to buy from the illegal market, and how without enough sufficient local licensing for retail, and if cannabis were to be banned for delivery, then folks are put in a place where they don't have any access. So with the subcommittee considering all these different pieces, we felt that the recommendation would address the issue of making sure that very sick people could still have access to their medicine, and Californians who voted for Prop 64 for adult use would be able to have access as well.
Can I ask a quick question? It's following up on the reasonably regulate part. So, Tamar Todd. Is the thought behind the committee recommendation that localities should be able to reasonably regulate the delivery companies that are coming in, even though those companies aren't licensed or located within the jurisdiction of the locality? Right, so they're coming in from another city, but the city in which they enter will be allowed to also regulate them?
Correct.
Committee Member Williams, I guess where I'm having a hard time is reasonably is not defined anywhere. So it's very subjective in the application. So would it be better served if there was a definition aspect as to what reasonably means?
Do you have a suggestion for the question, Ms. Wu?
I think you would have to look at other best practices in the definition of what reasonably means, and based off of all the considerations that were just brought forward, that could be incorporated in some type of definition within the regulations, because if you're going to use it in multiple regulations where reasonably is a term used, it should have a application across the board.
There was also a conversation, there was a conversation yesterday around alcohol and different counties and the when and how they can actually sell alcohol. And maybe Member Harada, do you want to touch on that?
That was surrounding local ordinances versus state law. And an example I gave was if a liquor store was licensed where they were conditioned to stop sales at 11 p.m. locally, but state law or state conditions was 1 p.m. or 1 a.m., I'm sorry, it's up to that business owner to comply with the local ordinance of stopping sales at 11 p.m. regardless if the state condition was 1 a.m. It ultimately falls back on the business owner to comply with both state law and local municipal laws.
And to add to that, our understanding is local jurisdictions under their local control have certain land use authorities that they can already use. So we just want to affirm that they have the ability for local control in these areas, like time, manner, place.
David Woolsey, I really struggle with this issue because on the one hand, I support local government's ability to control what happens in their jurisdiction. And on the other hand, I don't support the illegal market, and a lack of access is one of the big drivers for people to go to the illegal market if they want to access the legal market. So it's really a challenge to try to balance those two interests. So while I support local control, I think I don't support the illegal market more. So yeah, it's a really tough position to be in. So I do appreciate the work that you guys put in and the conversation that you've had and the public's comments as well. Thank you.
If I can just comment also, one of the things that we were concerned with when we added that, and we were concerned about that not defining what reasonable parameters were. Because you could take any location and they could say, well, you can deliver cannabis then between 1 and 2 p.m. And so we want to avoid that. That's why we did put in the word reasonable, but we also had the discussion that the illicit market is driven by lack of access. That's what we're trying to get away from.
Member Stevenson, I'd like to state that my belief that is best that access is allowed for all citizens of the state, and that municipalities, if they wish to restrict access to their community, that it could be done by that municipality not licensing the actual business activities. So that would allow the municipalities to have local control. However, I do believe that the citizenry has the actual authority as to what they want to do within their own homes.
Do I see any other comments? Mr. Will?
So I'm just thinking, what does a vote for versus a vote against really mean, right? Technically, based on the current rules, you have unfettered access, right? Because you are allowed to deliver anywhere. So by voting no, I'm saying let's keep the current rules and give unfettered access, right? A vote yes is kind of pushing for some type of quasi-reasonable local jurisdiction. Am I thinking through that right or wrong?
Considering we're an advisory committee and we're just suggesting, we're not actually choosing whether there's more regulations added to this. We just wanted the state to understand that we do support the language as it is right now in the regulations.
Okay, so if I was to vote no, I am supporting that.
No, I think a no vote says that you would support locals' right to restrict that access.
I thought the current rule is that you don't have the right to restrict.
Yeah, so I think what we're getting into some like really technical stuff, because currently, as written, there isn't a definition that reasonable rules for local control. It's just clear cut that they have a right to be able to deliver. The modification to the recommendation actually takes it away from, so
Right, so
it makes it really hard for a person to figure out how they would react to this, because if they want it to be the way it is totally with no local control, then it would be no, I think is the way I would interpret it. But if you want there to be some local control and address some of the concerns, then this is a slight modification to the state. It isn't saying that the state is wrong in allowing delivery, but it's saying that the state should allow some local control, like setting hours of operation, is the way I'm gathering it. And that would be what the yes vote would
Right,
be.
so the yes is for allowing some form of local control, whereas of no is really stating the message, let's keep the language as is, and that is unfettered access.
What we can do is, oh, someone's on. What we can do is change the motion and get rid of reasonable, and I'm open to that.
I would be open to that as well.
This is Member Nikita. May I? So the way I read the motion is that a motion 4 is to support is an affirmation of the committee's support of the existing rule, with the notation that if there are additional reasonable restrictions that a locality wants to place on delivery, we're also okay with that. A no vote, in my mind, we're not taking a position on the existing rule, because we're not making any recommendation or any affirmation of support. I also don't believe, in my opinion, that the existing rule doesn't allow for any local control. I think we still have local control in our jurisdictions. We just can't exclude, under the regulation, exclude someone from delivering if they're licensed in another jurisdiction into our jurisdiction, but I don't see that as limiting our reasonable time, place, manner laws that we may have in place now. So I don't know. I mean, I think all we're voting on, in my estimation, is that the committee endorses the rule that's in place, and a no vote is not an endorsement one way or the other.
So I think we're at the point where we could take a motion now and then open up to the public, or we could open up to the public. Is there anybody who wishes to make a motion?
Yeah, I just want to add one last thing. Did we not have someone from a city come in and say that they banned recreational delivery?
There was someone that came.
So we did have a city in our subcommittee meeting state that she was supporting medical delivery, but that they banned recreational, correct?
Adult use, correct.
So if that's the case, then that's not unfettered.
So I would, and if, I would like to amend the motion to just directly affirm the current Bureau's state regulations on statewide delivery, particularly for section 5416D.
I'll second that.
Do we have any further conversation from the committee?
I'm sorry, can we say who made the motion and who made the second for the court report, please? Thank you.
Beverly, you made the motion.
Member Heidelbach, second.
So is there any new discussion by the committee before we open up to public comment?
Really, again, more of a point of clarification. Currently, I think the dispute that's existing is if you're a delivery service set up in LA, for the sake of argument, let's say Long Beach bans deliveries. There's a big fight going on between local jurisdictions in the state in the lawsuit whether or not the local jurisdictions are allowed to ban deliveries into their city when they've banned all commercial campus activities within their city. So is a yes vote supporting, and I guess, supporting the state's position, saying that if you have a license for a delivery service in a city that allows deliveries, you're allowed unrestricted access to deliver to other jurisdictions, even if they have a ban on commercial activities? Is that the case?
Yes, that's the motion.
Perfect. And I just also want to clarify, because when you said delivery into banned jurisdictions, my understanding of the existing rule is it also prohibits cities or localities that have licensed retail stores that they allow to deliver within the jurisdiction. They can't disallow out of jurisdiction deliveries in as well. So it's not just you can't ban delivery in if you've banned businesses. You also can't ban delivery in even if you're a city like San Francisco that has a lot of licensed dispensaries and allows delivery from those dispensaries, correct?
Correct. If I could just remind everyone one more time, last year in August, we considered this same section in law and it passed. So I want us to remind everyone that this is not something new. This is something that has come before us, and I hope everyone can support this motion. Thank you.
Just to make sure, the amended motion is to affirm support of the current regulations on statewide delivery, specifically Bureau Regulation 5416D.
Correct.
And we have a motion and a second. Could we open for public comment?
Now open up for public comment on the motion. Anybody that'd like to make a public comment, please come up and take a seat. Speaker 1, you may start.
Christian Simmons, young entrepreneur, ex-Ease delivery driver. Delivering for Ease last year in San Diego County, there were some local jurisdictions that banned delivery service, but Ease, a big company, they employ dispensaries to actually carry their product and send out delivery drivers to them, contract delivery drivers. I was one of them. For 3 weeks, I was doing deliveries and not being compensated for it. I believe that businesses should be following state regulatory sanctions instead of local ones, because some locals, they said their rules are too lenient, where the states could be mandatory and then the local governments can either cut short but not extend. So meaning if the state says 10 p.m., only the local can cut it at 8 p.m. They couldn't extend it to 11. Because I was delivering to areas where it was not safe, and then I was delivering to areas such as La Jolla. Also, the security is a concern too. Drivers were carrying product and just sitting around. So I definitely think there should be more to consider when it comes to delivery.
Thank you very much. Speaker 2, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jamal Barghouti and I work for Blackbird. We are licensed distributors, but we also facilitate direct-to-consumer delivery. And something that I just want to point out about delivery and about non-storefront retail licenses is that it is one of the lowest barriers of entry for entrepreneurs, specifically entrepreneurs from disenfranchised communities. And so for putting regulations around non-storefront retail licenses and delivery, how are we impacting social equity and these entrepreneurs that are already putting so much into this effort, and how are we constricting that through this process? And so, I believe that delivery is extremely important, and access to delivery and delivery licenses. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker 3, go ahead.
Hello, Luis Rivera, Collective Strategies and Social Equity LA. My understanding that it's the government's job, the BCC and this committee's job, to to enable the market, not inhibit the legal cannabis industry. So I think at the end of the day, it's your job to enable it, to expand it and allow it to thrive. I think Kevin De Leon, last week I was at the UCBA Policy Summit, said that it's local authority, heavy regulation, and the illegal market that's crippling our legal market. So we don't need more regulation. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers on the motion? Seeing none, we'll close public comment.
Thank you very much. After hearing the comment, I see we have okay. I didn't know if we had a board member that wanted to make some additional comments, but so I guess we call the roll.
Boboulian,
Strong yes.
Heidelbach?
Yes.
Harada? Huffman? Farrow?
Yes.
Todd? Leff?
Aye.
Nevdal?
Aye.
Nikita?
No?
Peck? Yes. Stevenson?
Yes.
Sweeney?
Yes.
Williams?
Abstain.
Woolsey?
Aye.
Wu? You?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Now let's take the next item up for consideration.
The second motion is to recommend the removal of the address from the delivery request receipt for non-storefront retailers, specifically to strike the term address from section 5420A1 of the Bureau's regulations.
So do we have any discussion on the recommendation? Seeing none, open to public comment. Or do we want to do the motion first? We can do a motion first.
I'll make a motion to accept the recommendation as presented. Yes, Member Nevedal made that motion, made that first.
Left seconds.
Now we'll open up for public comment.
If you'd like to make a comment on this motion, please come up. Can we repeat the motion, please?
The motion is to remove the address from the delivery request receipt for non-storefront retailers, specifically to strike the term address from section 5420A1 of the Bureau's regulations.
Would anybody like to make a comment at this time? Great. We'll close public comment.
Seeing no public comment, it doesn't look like I have any hot mics. Can we take a roll?
Babulian?
Aye.
Heidelbach? Harada?
Aye.
Huffman? Farrow?
No.
Todd? Leff?
Aye.
Nevdal?
Aye.
Nikita? Peck?
Aye.
Stevenson?
Aye.
Sweeney?
Aye.
Williams?
No.
Woolsey?
Aye.
Wu? You?
Aye.
Motion passes.
And then the third recommendation?
The third recommendation is to support the 10 p.m. cutoff with the active order that the sales transaction must be made before the 10 o'clock cutoff, but allow local jurisdictions to implement reasonable cutoffs.
So do we have any comments on that recommendation?
So, again, just trying to translate that last part is what does that mean?
Me too.
I think maybe for the sake of clarity for everyone on the committee, if we could strike the portion on the reasonable limit for the local control portion, for the local regulation portion. And
So you'd like the motion to read, recommend supporting the 10 p.m. cutoff with the active order that the sales transaction must be made before the 10 o'clock cutoff.
yes, I move to amend the motion to state that.
Member Heidelbach, second.
Okay, with the amended recommendation, do we have any comments? Seeing no comments, do I have a motion to accept the amended recommendation?
Member Nevedal will make a motion to accept the amended recommendation.
Can I get a second?
Second.
Well, that will open up for public comment.
Can you clarify who made the second for the record?
Bulbullion?
Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you, Speaker. Go ahead.
The earlier you close the legal market, the earlier you close the legal market, the more you support the other stores.
Thank you. Any other member of the audience like to make a comment? Seeing none, we'll close public comment.
Okay, any further comment by committee? If not, can you call the roll?
Bubulian,
Aye.
Heidelbach,
Aye.
Harada,
Aye.
Huffman, Farrow,
Aye.
Todd, Leff,
Aye.
Nevdal,
Aye.
Nikita,
Aye.
Peck, Stevenson, Sweeney,
Aye.
Williams,
Aye.
Woolsey,
Aye.
Wu, Yu.
Aye.
Motion passes.
So that concludes the work on item number 5. So let's move on to item number 6. Mr. Sweeney?
Yes, we are taking up the issue of equity, and we do have a series of recommendations. The members of that subcommittee included Avis, included Jeff and Alice, David Woozy, Tamar, Todd, and myself as chair of the equity subcommittee. We are clearly strong supporters of equity, and we had a series of recommendations, and I would like to ask staff to read the recommendations, and then we can move further.
For the record, I want to make sure that we add Ms. Peck was also a
So you
participant.
forgot the Indian again.
Oh, Lord. You got me, Miss Peck. But you know I love you, so I'm sure you're going to forgive me for that.
So the first recommendation is that licensing authorities collect and provide demographic data on applicants and licensees to the committee and public to the extent provided by law, including ownership and employee demographic data.
Do we have any conversation or questions by the committee on that particular recommendation?
I certainly want to move the recommendation.
So we have a motion to move it. Do I have a second? Ms. Huffman? Any other comments?
Comment. Member Nikita.
Yes, ma'am.
Do we know, does the state collect this type of demographic data that would be meaningful for this discussion as part of their application process?
Currently, the state does not.
That's the reason that we are requesting it, because this data and information is essential to fully understand the scope of the problem and the issue, and it would make us better able to inform public policy. So that you certainly asked the salient question.
I would also further suggest that we read the second motion, because some of the points in the second recommendation include what you do with the data once it's collected. So, I mean, would
May I
you
ask a question about the first motion?
Sure.
First, I mean, I know we want to kind of move things along, but I'm curious if the state doesn't currently gather this data, what that might look like for the application process and what that means for businesses, because as a licensed cannabis business, this motion suggests that every time there's a new hire that comes on, we're going to have to enter that information into I'm assuming the portal or send a notification, and then anytime staffing changes, we'll be constantly updating. And currently, I don't believe that we are required as licensees to register staff with the Bureau or any of the licensing authorities. So I am a little concerned that this would trigger a whole nother level of what needs to be technologically put into the portal from the regulatory side, but then also a whole nother level of how businesses register staff. So I'm just not sure about expense to the licensing authorities and how that might trickle back to the business at hand. So
The only thing I think the intent was, and Mr. Sweeney could probably highlight on that, I think it was around the discussion of equity licensing. And if you're an equity licensee that's applying, seeking some type of first mover's advantage or some other assistance, then that would be the situation in which you would be providing this. But if you're a business licensee that is just complying with the traditional application, that might not be something you would need to do. And I think the purpose is to encourage that if there's an equity licensee who has a business, that if it were to transition or move, that we could track and make sure that the new owner might be also an equity licensee and employer, so that way we can ensure that equity is also looked at in employment. But I may be wrong.
Can I go? So this is Tamar Todd. I actually don't interpret it that way. I think that the recommendation is to try and get an understanding of the demographics of ownership and employment in the industry as a whole, so we can better understand the composition of the industry in its entirety and what that looks like when we're evaluating the success of any equity programs we have. What I don't think it requires, though, with the recommendation is a directive to the agency as to how they have to collect that, that it would have to include individual information about specific employees, or that it would have to be in real time. I envision it as something that could happen with a license renewal, that you submit, demographics of your company or something like that. So it's a requirement of some collection and maintenance of data, but not a dictation of how it has to do it. We also did include there, in compliance with existing law, which I know there are some restrictions on in California, of what kind of information you can require to be collected.
great, thank you for that clarification.
So we had a motion and a second on this, I believe. So is there further comment? Then let's open it up for public comment. And maybe we might want Kayla to reread the recommendation, so that way the folks coming up will know what we're talking about.
Yes, please.
The recommendation is that licensing authorities collect and provide demographic data on applicants and licensees to the committee and to the public to the extent provided by law, including ownership and employee demographic data.
So we'll open up for public comment. If you have a comment on the motion, please come up, take a seat.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Iman Hobbs-Brown, social equity candidate. Just on the fly, I do think it is important for this type of information to be gathered if it's not already, because what you may find is there's a huge disparity in ownership, that being people of color, women even, whether or not people are actually being employed from the communities where these dispensaries and retail locations are located. I think if there is a certain responsibility to report out and have transparency as to who's owning these dispensaries, who they're employing, and essentially who these types of businesses are benefiting. If there's a requirement for that to come out because they know that reporting or something like that has to be submitted, that could affect some change, or at the very least, to the gentleman's point, inform any disparities or areas where there needs to be more equity and push it forward. So I definitely am in support of that. I'd like to speak and encourage that something be passed and move forward to make sure that this type of information is made available and the transparency is there moving forward. That's it.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker number 2, go ahead.
I wanted to reiterate something that I heard in the subcommittee public comment yesterday when we were speaking on equity, and that is to urge mindfulness in this approach and in collecting this data. I believe that too often it can be left up to the 6 federal categorizations of race and the 2 gender categorizations that are recognized by federal law. And so I believe that in this approach, we need to be dialectical in the way that we're gathering this data to really paint a picture. People like myself, I am a first-generation Palestinian, and if I were a license holder, according to the federal government, that it marks me as white. And so I believe that that nuance needs to be approached with mindfulness of understanding how we collect data specifically from these disenfranchised communities to provide a more robust understanding of the full impact of the war on drugs on disenfranchised communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker. Any other speakers at this time? Seeing none, we'll close public comment.
So before we go to the vote, I'm going to ask, I know the state of California, I appreciate the federal guidelines, but I think the state of California has a much broader definition of data and how we put people into different groups and identify them. Would that be, we would follow the state's guidelines on how, for lack of a better term, he talked about 4 races and 2 genders. We have significantly more in the state. We wouldn't have to expand. I know that when we do stuff, we treat, even our equity training and our stuff here, we treat it very differently. So would we follow the state's guidelines on how we define? Sorry, would we define in a situation of gathering data what the state, how the state defines individuals versus the way the federal government?
Typically, we would follow any requirements by the state.
Okay, I feel much better about that. Okay, with that, do we have any?
Make one more comment, Member Nikita. This is just a comment, really not a motion or anything, but it strikes me that as somebody who works for an agency that gathers a lot of data, sometimes the data needs a professional analysis, and sometimes that is not just providing the data printouts and in your spreadsheets or what have you. It really would make sense if the state does start collecting this data to fund a comprehensive analysis of the data from an organization that does that. There are universities that can crunch those numbers. I think the last speaker had an excellent point about the nuances involved in really understanding what's happening across this landscape. And so just a personal recommendation, one person, if you do collect the data, you need someone to analyze it. We can't this committee will not be able to handle it, I don't think, just getting the numbers on a sheet.
Thank you. So seeing no additional comments from the committee, can we have a vote on the motion?
Babuian?
Aye.
Heidelberg?
Aye.
Harada?
Aye.
Huffman?
Aye.
Farrow?
Aye.
Todd?
Aye.
Leff?
Aye.
Nevdal?
Aye.
Nikita?
Aye.
Peck?
Aye.
Stevenson? Aye. Sweeney?
Aye.
Williams?
Aye.
Woolsey?
Aye.
Wu?
Aye.
You?
Aye.
Motion passes.
And then moving on to the second recommendation.
Okay. The second recommendation is that the Bureau, in conjunction with other state agencies, form a statewide social equity program that seeks to collect data, develop a criteria for social equity applicants and local social equity programs, audit and enforce the local equity programs, make recommendations to the legislative body and other regulatory bodies, including recommendations regarding financial support, such as fee deferments, loans, and other financial support, and regarding level of funding for the social equity programs. Provide technical assistance and solicit input from communities most impacted by the war on drugs, and include priority processing, focus on workforce development and educational opportunities. In addition, funds should also be used to help with legal assistance with past cannabis convictions.
See what I meant when we said we should have just talked about some of the stuff Mr. Nikita raised there is how we're going to use it. So maybe not a professional group.
I can't hear you.
Sorry, I just said that the second one was much more comprehensive and it addressed a lot of the questions that came up on the first one. But on that, do we have any other comments from the committee?
Yes, just simply say that this is vitally important, and I look forward to a favorable support.
Any other comments? Very good.
One more comment. I'm late.
That's all right.
On the mic.
Yeah, that's all right.
I would suggest adding just one aspect to that, and that is for the state to consider, or for the agencies to consider tax rebates for equity applicants. So not that's my first applause. But I'm just saying, it's not something that would allow a disparate level of competition, but something that would allow them to maintain a level of profitability as they come up and running.
First of all, I think that that's an excellent amendment. We were certainly at the end, we said, and in other financial, and that was one of those, but maybe we could make it more express instead of implied. So I appreciate that clarification. If the seconder is willing to take that as a friendly amendment, I would be willing to endorse what you're saying.
Yeah, so if you're talking about the subcommittee's recommendation, it was Tamar and myself was the second, so you'd need the first and the second to modify the recommendation.
Well, you know what to do, go ahead.
Well, isn't it just to make a motion to this committee to adopt it?
We
with the
could-
modification?
we
We
can
can't
make an
change
indi-
what the subcommittee did now.
No, because we don't have we've not constituted the
Right,
whole
but we can
subcommittee.
make the new motion with that modification. I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So are you willing to make that motion?
Yes.
Okay.
So moved.
I'll make the second.
And I just have a quick question for Tamara, I guess, in terms of where we stick it in there. It's something like a tax rebate. So if the state agency establishes a social equity program, and part of the things are within the purview of that program to do, but part would have to be recommendations to the legislature, which we say like levels of funding. So with something like a tax rebate, that would have to be a recommendation to the legislature to allow
Right,
for
so,
the equity program.
there would be, there's a couple of issues. Normally tax would have to go to the legislature. The other thing to keep in mind is your taxes, your cultivation tax and the excise tax were actually in Prop 64 itself. They were not a creation of legislation. So in order to change proposition, there's a higher threshold in terms of the votes you would need. And in some instances, it has to go back to the voters.
Okay, so I would just suggest in terms of the amendment, there's a part where we say in terms of the amendment to it, we say makes recommendations to the legislature for appropriate levels of funding and maybe perhaps also add and tax rebates back to social equity licensees.
And I'd like to add that I don't want to be overly technical here, but the language is permissive and not mandatory. So it's precatory language here. And so it's saying that it would consider this.
Sorry, your mic turned off.
Yeah, it would consider this. So I'm just saying it is not mandatory, it is discretionary.
And Member Nikita, just a unrelated comment. I was, well, related, but kind of unrelated. I was in Sacramento in one of these committee hearing rooms for some other bill, and one of the dozens of cannabis bills came up, and the author of the bill said, the Cannabis Advisory Committee recommends blah, blah, blah. And so I think our recommendations do filter up to the legislators, and they have read them, and it has informed the actions that they've taken in authoring certain bills. So I think it's still important that we do it, even if it is a message to the legislature as opposed to a message to the regulators.
So I'm a little lost for where we're at. Were you going to add that in and then reread the new addition for us so we can consider that?
So the amended motion is that the Bureau, in conjunction with other state agencies, form a statewide social equity program that seeks to collect data, develop a criteria for social equity applicants and local social equity programs, audit and enforce the local equity programs, make recommendations to the legislative body and other regulatory bodies regarding level of funding for the social equity programs, including consideration of tax rebates for social equity applicants, providing technical assistance, also soliciting input from communities most impacted by the war on drugs, and include priority processing, focus on workforce development, financial support such as fee deferrals, loans, and other financial support, and educational opportunities. Funds should also be used to help with legal assistance with past cannabis convictions.
So is there any comments on the reread with the modified motion? Seeing none, we have a first and second. Can we go to public comment, please?
So again, please come up if you'd like to make a comment on the motion. Speaker, go ahead. It's on.
For the business development stuff, everything I'm seeing is for somebody that wants a license. What about for the people that are going from the unlicensed businesses to something else that isn't necessarily a job that pays minimum wage to somebody that has a corporate structure already established? Like, what kind of business development can be part of the social equity for that?
I'm sorry, this is public comment, so if you have a question, please form it as a comment and not a question.
Can social equity include business development for people not seeking a cannabis license, but from the businesses that you're closing?
I think what she's suggesting, rather than asking a question, because we can't answer public comment, you could frame that in a way that would say you believe that there should be something, so we can consider that for a future agenda item, if potentially. So could you frame it in a way that you're making a suggestion?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number one. The mic is on.
Hi, my name is Kathy Smith. I'm in the cannabis industry for the past almost 13 years in the city of LA. As we know, the city of LA has the largest amount of cannabis businesses that we're going to have probably in the entire state. We have a social equity program that is a complete farce. It is not going to work. It's never going to work the way it's written. And at some point, BCC has to step in and say, we have got to monitor what's going on with this fake social equity program that's going on across the state. It is not going to work. You have to give some resources. And what you guys are proposing is to give these resources, and it's absolutely necessary that you guys do that. And I appreciate the fact that some of you do ask questions, because if you're asking questions amongst yourselves, imagine what we're sitting in the audience doing. We're so confused as to what's going on each time you guys say something. I still don't understand what happened with delivery, what the outcome was, and I'm sitting in the front row. So again, and Joe, you adding in that tax information or that waiver or discount or however you guys want to label it is absolutely necessary. But you must step in and look at what's going on the local levels, because it's a complete mess, and you guys are saying our hands are off and we don't know what's going on. And that's where the problem is. So no matter what you implement here, if the local municipalities
Speaker.
are doing something, you
Thank you.
guys have to step up and make those changes.
Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you.
Speaker number 2, go ahead, and I'll just make a comment that all the microphones on this table are on, so no need to turn them on.
Hello again. I do second the sentiment that Kathy mentioned. Social equity is a great opportunity, and it was voted in by the people here because, we have hope and we want this thing to work. But I think that it's uncharted territory on a lot of sides. So in my experience, what really mitigates that and makes sure that it's successful is just open communication, transparency, all of that. To that end, I'm really hoping that you all will move forward and pass something that's going to allow for, again, more transparency, more resources available to social equity candidates. And I heard a big part was education. That's major for us. If we're educated and we have a clear understanding of what's available to us, and we're able then to weigh in and share from our side what we need, then that means that everybody can move seamlessly forward in a way where we can make informed decisions together. And that's really the heart of equity, is it not? So that's my suggestion. I'm glad that there's even talk on the table about having, some kind of institution in place to monitor and have accountability, and I just would love for it to move forward and for there to be opportunities for communication on both sides, social equity and those in place to help us and really make this thing work the way it was voted to work. I think it can work. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker number 3, go ahead.
Hello, committee. My name is Asaf Moses Sobers. My mother and sister are social equity applicants, and in 2015, I was hit by a truck in front of my school, 3 blocks away from here. I've had a traumatic brain injury and medical issues ever since. My disability made it hard to keep going to school, and to make matters worse, in 2017, drug-sniffing dogs came to my school, and I got ticketed and suspended a semester away from graduating. Cannabis saved me after a traumatic brain injury, yet the police officers treated me like an addict and a criminal, despite being licensed. I couldn't return to school after that happened, and I became quite depressed and suicidal after. I want this committee to know that the war on drugs didn't end in 2016, and my story is proof. We need major education reform and money for community reinvestment. While cannabis saved my life, LA's social equity program gives me and my family hope for a financially stable future. Thank you.
I'm sorry, your time is up, Speaker.
Finish your thought, please.
I appreciate that. I don't have my diploma yet, and I don't know if I can get into college, but social equity means I have the opportunity to own a family business in cannabis. Please vote to approve the subcommittee's recommendations and vote to give hope to young people like me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker 1, go ahead.
That was my baby brother. He's pretty great. Good morning. My name is Janvi Sobers. I'm a social equity applicant in the city of LA. I come before you to speak in support of the Social Equity Subcommittee's recommendations and to express to this committee the transformative potential of social equity. Last June, I came home to Los Angeles from New York University, the first person in my family to graduate from both high school and college. I was the only one who made it out. My family made incredible sacrifices to keep me in school. My mother is a former foster youth and survivor of the war on drugs and a social worker who's dedicated her life to advocating for youth. She took out loans, pawned jewelry, and went without to pay for my education, all while trying to keep my siblings from the jaws of the criminal justice system like my brother just described. The social equity program has given my family hope. And it's a work in progress. We need the state's support, but it has absolutely done a great thing for the city of LA and could do a great thing for this entire state. And we as Californians have the opportunity to lead the entire country as we move towards national and international cannabis relations. I'd like to say that reiterate what my brother said. Cannabis saved his life, but social equity gives him a future. Cannabis heals my mother's trauma that she experienced from being incarcerated as a juvenile for cannabis, but social equity gives her a future past trauma. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker 2, go ahead.
My name is Jamal Barghouti, and I am the Equity Outreach Manager for Blackbird. In my position, I am focused on aligning our software and services with the equity programs in all of the markets that we are in. One of my frustrations is that in the Cannabis Equity Act of 2018, it stated that the BCC should be the central organization and the touch point for equity programs in California. Yet when I reached out to the BCC when I started in this position a few months ago, they couldn't even tell me the cities that had equity programs. So I believe that there is a lot of work to be done in understanding who's working in equity, how these equity programs are operating, and that would allow for other larger corporations to get invested, because I believe that it takes the public, the government, the activists, and the industry to truly make social equity work. And by moving forward, I believe with this recommendation and eventually creating more kind of oversight over this entire process, I believe that the BCC makes a very strong statement, and California in general makes a very strong statement in support of equity and in righting the wrongs of the war on drugs.
Thank you, Speaker. If there's anybody else that'd like to make a public comment, please go ahead and take an empty seat. Speaker, go ahead.
Hi, just wanted to repeat a quote from Ms. Peck. You forgot the Indian again. Most of Riverside County's mountains are considered tribal land, and there's over 50,000 tribal members, voting citizens. If you don't place the word tribal member or tribe in your, if you just consider tribes, please, then your numbers would be correct. Your data will not be correct if you exclude any population. So I don't understand how we can continue to exclude the tribes. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker.
My name is Lisa Sawadillo. I'm an attorney, and part of my previous practice was in dependency court. So I would like to echo what Jan and Asaf Sobers had so eloquently spoken about, is that there is health equity issues in terms of herbal medicine and cannabis being used by children and for seizure disorders and things like ADHD. And I believe there should be some sort of effort to gather statistics regarding the issues that present themselves in dependency court and through DCFS, so that policy can be considered with regard to our children and cannabis, and not just a blanket no cannabis for anyone under 18, period. I also happen to see the children impacted by the war on drugs because their parents were incarcerated, and having to explain to the children that they can't live with their parents anymore was difficult. So I'd just like to share that with you.
Thank you, Speaker. Any other comments on the motion? Thank you. The question was if there's more motions on equity.
This was a wrap-up motion, and so it included multiple topics versus, so.
Hello. Luis Rivera, Collective Strategies, Social Equity LA, also a licensed cannabis event organizer. Just got my provisional, so thank you for that. I'm a 15-year-old. I've worked in the government, nonprofit, and the community for 15 years, born and raised in Los Angeles, and both a victim of the war on drugs when I was young, and been able to come and thrive and be able to now be in a position to help others to get into this. When it comes to social equity, though, I think there's a couple of things we can better do moving forward. And one is the income guidelines, I think, don't really make sense. One is that they should be driven either by the time of the arrest and by when the person actually went through the crime, the episode, or two, should eradicate that totally, because if you've changed your life around and you've been able to do more with that, then you should be able to, actually help others and seek the support that you guys are intending to give for the program. And ultimately, I think in general, anybody that's either been arrested, charged, or convicted of a cannabis crime in California should have an automatic entry into a license. No fees, no nothing. Just the same way you guys throw us in jail, just give us all a license. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker 2, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Naeem Hassan. I'm a social equity applicant in the city of Los Angeles. Just wanted to come before the committee and tell you guys, as an applicant and someone who's been affected by the war on drugs, I believe that this state and the community and this committee has a duty to ensure that not only everyone of this beautiful state has the opportunity to participate, but also, and mainly importantly, more specifically, those who have been affected and who didn't have the economic opportunities that this would afford them. And also to be able to create a way for generational wealth and just to be all over, overall citizens of this beautiful state. And to be able to participate in something like this is definitely life-changing. And also to bring forth some issues that you guys might not know, as being a person that's from communities that didn't have economic support as much as others. There are people who come into our communities and who want to fund these businesses, but the practices and the contracts that they're coming with are predatory. So we need people that, we need you guys to monitor that and be able to watch over that and protect the interests of the program for the people that is involved. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker 3, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Mustafa Jabril. I'm a social equity applicant as well as a victim of the war on drugs. In my community, I've seen the doors torn down. I've seen people, houses deal with tear gas and flash bombs, and sometimes the parents get shot, sometimes it's the kids, sometimes they lose their dogs, which is a way of dealing with losses. I've seen kids be relocated away from their communities and family and friends and schools, which put them in a worse place of being traumatized. It furthers their traumatization. They have to deal with molestation, human trafficking. This has raised the rates of mass incarceration. It's caused mental health issues with a lot of our people in our community. Parents have been placed in the state and federal facilities 10, 20 years because of this. Lack of parenting for our youth, poor social skills, social growth. I know people that can't obtain jobs because of this. They can't be police officers, firefighters, Coast Guards, because they may have been charged with selling marijuana or the use of drugs or something like that in our community. So now this stuff is legal. It's legal. And the same thing that we had to do in order to survive, the state is doing and making money off of it. So expunge these records and give us some decent contracts. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker number 1, go ahead.
Good afternoon. I just weren't my kids great? They were awesome. Asaf and Janvi are mine. My name is Mickey McKinney. I'm an MSW, mother, a grandmother. As a social worker, I specialize in trauma-informed services and advocacy for youth in and from foster care and juvenile systems. The state's allocation of funding to your cities and your oversight will also serve to educate and bring awareness about safe and responsible cannabis use, shifting a culture of stigma and stereotyping, alienation, and criminalization. A state's grant objectives for funding should require reporting on data. Data now shows that a disproportionate number of Black and brown men are still in prison on parole and on probation. A disproportionate number of single mothers of color lose custody of their children because of cannabis use. They're labeled as unfit or treated like addicts. Data shows a disproportionate number of students are suspended, expelled, and drop out because of cannabis use. We also know that young adults enter foster care for cannabis use only to age out of care labeled as drug users. In addition, we know that young adults are placed on probation given violations on the terms of that probation and placed in group homes and locked facilities for cannabis use. Legalizing cannabis use without social equity and/or a state program is like a marriage without a commitment. Communities and families need a commitment from the state to prioritize youth and families in the allocation of resources derived from legalizing a product that has harmed their communities and their legacy. Your specific and direct action and funding is a stand on reconciliation.
Thank you. Thank you, Speaker. Speaker 1, go ahead.
Hi, my name is George Finley, and I was the owner of the Divine Design Melchizedek Love and Light Healing Center in Leimert Park. I've healed a lot of people with cannabis and with other aspects, but I want to know what are we going to do about the veterans? I'm a disabled veteran. I'm a service-connected veteran, service-connected disability. What are we going to do about the veterans? I was arrested at the VA in Westwood for having 7 grams of marijuana on me, and I had to go through a whole bunch of stuff to alleviate that. And I think it's a problem. We go over there, we fight, we lose our lives for our country, and we come back in and we can't even participate in a healing, cannabis healing. What's wrong with that? I don't see anything wrong with that. I mean, it's a lot of brothers out there. We have a lot of problems. We have a lot of mental issues. Some people have mental issues, and there's 25 veterans dying every day. They could be smoking some cannabis to relieve some of this tension, some of this stress, and some of this stuff that we can't sleep at night. I hardly ever get any sleep. But I'm still here pushing with the Los Angeles cannabis, equities, Los Angeles social equities program. And another thing I'd like to bring up is, well, I fell from 2 stories, and I busted my head open, cracked my neck, and I was hooked up with Sister Samaya. She has the only cannabis in Los Angeles that was ever legalized, and she helped me a lot. She helped me recover totally from eating cannabis and from smoking it, and just relaxing, and it worked. I mean, this is something that everybody should try if you're having any kind of pains or anything. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you. And I'll just note that, yes, your children are great and all of you are great, right? We've been in this committee for a little over 19 months. We're all volunteers. Every one of us came here with an idea of what this was, and if anybody on this committee hasn't changed some of the way they look at things, then they weren't here. So we thank you for your participation, and we hope to be able to help you. But that said, there are things under the Proposition 64 that may have to go back to a full-wide state ballot. Some things will have to go through the legislature, and if our recommendations can affect regulations that can be made, we're going to do our best to try to make those recommendations come to life. So thanks. So with that, I'm going to have Kayla reread the final recommendation that has a first and second, and then we'll have our committee, if they have any questions or suggestions, and if not, we'll go to a vote. Thanks.
So the recommendation is that the Bureau, in conjunction with other state agencies, form a statewide social equity program that seeks to collect data, develop a criteria for social equity applicants, and local social equity programs. Audit and enforce local equity programs, make recommendations to the legislative body and other regulatory bodies regarding level of funding for the social equity programs, including tax rebates for social equity applicants, financial support such as fee deferrals and loans, and additional financial support. Provide technical assistance, solicit input from communities most impacted by the war on drugs, include priority processing for social equity applicants, focus on workforce development and educational opportunities. Additionally, funds should also be used to help with legal assistance with past cannabis convictions.
Ms. Yu?
Just a quick question here. My understanding is in order for an equity applicant to qualify for a state license, they need to have local licensing, correct?
Yes.
Now,
It depends. So for temporary licenses that we were issuing previously, yes. For annual licenses, the state can't issue a license if doing so would be in violation of the local ordinances. But that's not limited to equity. It's just the ordinances in that jurisdiction related to cannabis activity.
Got it. So one issue I just want to put out here, maybe if we don't have to work this into the recommendation today, if we don't feel like this is the place, but 76% of cities and counties don't even allow for a local dispensary license, for example. So, and that is one of the areas that don't allow for licenses. I just want to point that out, that it's very important that we look into what is the number of licenses even out there, making sure that equity applicants have a majority or a good number of these licenses. And we should also keep into account if there is even local licensing out there for a possible equity program to take place.
Thank you for your comments. I'm going to, like I told in our meeting yesterday, that this committee, subcommittee, is going to stay constituted. We had a speaker that was supposed to come that would give us a statewide overview that was unable to make it due to travel issues. And we had another speaker that we had hoped to be able to attend as well. And my goal will be to have them on our next agenda to continue on, but we shouldn't stop the actions that we want to make today to get the ball rolling. And if there's some modifications or additions in the next meeting, we will deal with those, but thank you. So can I take the roll if there's no other questions?
Baboyan? Aye. Heidelberg? Aye. Harada?
Aye.
Huffman?
Aye.
Farrow?
Aye.
Todd?
Aye.
Leff?
Aye.
Nevdal?
Aye.
Nikita?
Aye.
Peck? Aye. Stevenson?
Aye.
Sweeney?
Aye.
Williams?
Aye.
Woolsey?
Aye.
Wu? Aye. You?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you for your work. So we've finished the work of the three subcommittees' recommendations, and now we move on to, I think there, at the front table, there were some review of licensing authority statistics. Do any of the members of our committee have any comments, questions about those statistics that were provided?
Keep them coming.
I'm trying to find mine. There it is. So for those of you that didn't pick one up, there's item number one is the Bureau of Cannabis Control's licensing overview, active licenses by license type, enforcement, testing overview, failed cannabis goods batched by category, CDFA, Cal Cannabis, cultivation, licensing divisions, license overview, active license by license type, adult use, annual provisional, active licenses by license type, medicinal use, annual provisional, enforcement, California Department of Public Health, licenses overview, active licenses by license type, and enforcement. So doesn't appear we have any comments about the data that was provided or questions.
I have one question, Member Nikita. Well, actually, maybe I have more. But this is about the failed cannabis good batches by category.
Excuse me, can I make one comment?
Yes.
Just to read slowly and clearly for the court reporter, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. The failed cannabis goods batches by category, we have quite a bit of failures. Question about a couple of these buckets here. Label claims, is somebody here who can sort of explain, is a failure of label claims, is that just a mismatch of some kind of product content to the label?
Yeah, that's correct. But that we've resolved that situation with the finalization of our regs. So before, if there was something that didn't match from testing, what was already, because when it comes from the manufacturer, it's already labeled with all the cannabinoid content. If that didn't match after testing, it would have to fail because our distributors weren't allowed to change the label for those types of things. We worked with Department of Public Health because we are seeing those things fail. So we changed our regulations in the final regs, and our distributors are allowed to change the labels for that specifically. They can't label manufactured products, but they can make that change. So these are, because we want to make sure you understood where the numbers came from, but we're not failing for those things anymore because the distributors can make those changes. If that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. And injurious to human health, what kind of, there's only 2 of those, but what would fall within that failure category?
I don't have what those 2 are, but we could certainly get back to you.
Like razor blades inside the...
No, it wasn't anything like that. I'm not quite sure.
I won't press you. I understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions by the committee? With that, we can open up the public comment. If there's any questions, statements about the data that's provided.
Would anybody like to come up and make a public comment on the statistical data? The handout is provided up front in the registration table.
I know it's kind of interesting since it's not questioned from there, and it's just raw data that's provided. So I appreciate the work done by our licensing agencies to provide this information, and the explanation of the work that was done to alleviate the failures on labeling is obviously important to licensees. Ultimately, the goal is to protect the consumer, so having accurate labeling is important. So having a solution to be able to make sure that the product isn't wasted but is allowed to go to the consumer with accurate information is important. So thank you. So we can move on to the next item on the agenda, which is public comment for items not on the agenda. So do we have any public who'd like to come up and make any comments that aren't on the agenda? Oh, we see at least one. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Oh, sorry. Is this on?
Yes, it's on.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Jackie Subek. I'm here speaking to you today as a West Hollywood licensee and a longtime cannabis advocate. I'm here to speak to you about the next frontier, which is consumption lounges. Up and down the state, new lounges have been opening up to provide customers with a safe space to consume legal cannabis. Although business models will vary from lounge to lounge, each one of them wants to be able to sell non-infused foods and beverages alongside cannabis goods. Unfortunately, Section 5407 of the BCC regs prohibits the sale of non-cannabis products on the same premises as licensed cannabis products. So understanding the original intent of this was to prevent retailers from becoming convenience stores, it's had some really serious unintended consequences for our lounges. Retail stores are designed to be places for customers to come in and shop, purchase, and leave. Lounges, on the other hand, are intended to be experiences, a place where people who have cannabis experience, users, newcomers can enjoy cannabis in a comfortable and safe space. These are places intended to educate and open up the possibilities of what cannabis brings to our lives and break through age-old stigmas. In West Hollywood, we have 16 new lounge licensees who were selected in December of 2018. Every single lounge's business model was based around the idea of a restaurant, a cafe, a juice bar, whatever, none of which are possible due to the blockage of 5407. Incidentally, in the emergency regulations, may I, anybody?
Chair.
Thank you. In the emergency regulations, that section actually did, in fact, say that non-cannabis products could happen as long as the business was in compliance with local jurisdictions. So those words were removed in subsequent drafts, and so these businesses are now invalid. And for your reference, we have lounges that have been paying leases with super, super high rents for almost a year, and they don't even have a chance to open. So I strongly encourage this committee to agendize this matter and take it up and work together with myself and other lounges in the state to urgently fix these regulations so we get these businesses up and running. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Speaker 2.
Hi, Kathy Smith again. Again, in the industry for 13 years in the city of LA.
Oh, hold on.
Thank you. Kathy Smith, are you going to start my time again?
Will do.
Kathy Smith again. I just wanted to say it's really critical that BCC takes some sort of hand in dealing with the local jurisdictions. There's absolutely no way we can do any business in any city that we're in. It doesn't matter what city. I'm specifically in LA. If you guys are not able to step in and help us when there are issues. Right now, BCC again has a hands-off approach on pretty much everything. So everything that you implement, if the local city is doing something completely different, how are we supposed to deal with those issues? I'm not sure if you guys are addressing this or if you know what's going on. In some of these cities, we have a list of cities that have been participating in a lot of corruption, and you guys have no say-so in it. You can do nothing. That's what I'm being told. We are hands-off when it comes to anything that's going on in the cities. So at what point are you guys going to be able to step in? We have to have some sort of control and regulation by BCC, and that's not what's happening. People that are in the industry see that. People that are coming in don't know what's going on, so they're going to see it in the future. What do we need to do to get this done? Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Speaker. And then speakers on items that are not on the agenda. Thank you. If anybody else has any comment they would like to make on this item, please feel free to come and take an open seat.
Oh, getting comfortable. Hi. I'd like to make a suggestion that you create a subcommittee for veterans. My name is Sergeant Richard Alvarez, United States Marine Corps, Desert Storm, Desert Thunder. Sergeant Alvarez, United States Army, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation New Dawn. I, like the gentleman before, am worried about veterans, have been diagnosed with traumatic brain injury, PTSD, all kinds of pains, but cannabis really does help. I went through the gamut of medications and suffered mentally. My family suffered physically. This is an answer, and if we address it, then we can come up with a solution to the problems that us veterans have. We're closer than ever than discovering what we just let the Vietnam veterans go on with, which was shell shock. We're getting closer, but we're still afraid of the obvious answer. The obvious answer is not what my doctor said. I do not want a shot in my neck every month or so. A sativa joint in the morning to get me going, indica at night to help me sleep. It's that simple. This is a cure to a common cold, a lemon. But PTSD and whatnot has its own. This is the only cure that a burn victim to a couple of children in the nearby city use. This is the only thing that helps. So please take the restrictions off. Allow us the opportunity to heal ourselves. This is actually an ancient industry. Please come to those of us who know it. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker.
Your lemon, sir?
You can have it.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to get cold.
It's the cure to the cold.
It is.
Any other speakers at this time? Seeing none, we're close public comment.
Thank you for your public comments, and that last one was a good segue to our next item, which are discussion of future agenda items and possible action on creating the next meeting's agenda. We did get one request for a future agenda item in our mail, in our packets. And I guess I could read this one, which is it's critical that cottage business licenses be developed to allow small operators to compete in a marketplace that has been regulated for the benefit of large corporate operators. 2, local jurisdictions should be given the authority to establish their own ordinances. I'm sorry. Thank you. Yeah. I'm trying to show I'm a good reader, but I'm kidding. Local jurisdictions should be given the authority to establish their own ordinances and regulations that suit their constituents. While local jurisdictions have the ability to ban cannabis activity, they do not have the ability to embrace the industry as it suits their constituents. If their ordinance varies from the state's interpretation of the statute or strays from some of the more onerous and unnecessary aspects of the state regulations. And that was provided to us by Legally and Lovingly, SPC. So that's that comment for consideration.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I have a couple of agenda items.
Very good.
Number 1 is related to the motion that was passed here earlier. I'd like to have the Bureau and CDPH and Food and Ag, or any of them, discuss with us how they are going to assure quality and decreased variability in the laboratory industry. And the second motion is to consider regulation or changes in regulations to allow cannabis lounges to exist.
On the issue of cannabis lounges, they do exist, but are there special things within that consideration you want us to?
Well, the problem, as the testimony we received today, is that the regulations would allow cannabis lounges, but you can't sell anything else. You can't have a cafe, for example. You can't sell food that's not cannabis, et cetera, et cetera. So that should be considered.
Sure. Thank you for your comments.
Alice Member Bullion, we got the conversation started today with tribal involvement in the industry. Now, I'm not sure if it's ideal we set up like a working group, a subcommittee, and discuss it, the different aspects of it, and start coming to, there is some middle ground there, but we got the conversation started, let's continue the conversation. So my suggestion would be for the next meeting to set up a conversation on tribal involvement in the industry.
Hello?
Okay, so very good. Okay, Mr. Sweeney.
I would like to support what Avis is saying. I would like to go further. I would like to make a subcommittee. Our council has indicated that we don't want to get into a serial issue with 2 or 3 people. So I'm thinking that a subcommittee could be created for those who want to volunteer to serve on that subcommittee to support more government-to-government contacts as it pertains to the tribes in California.
Okay, thank you.
I have a.
Yes, ma'am.
Every time we have met, well, at least while I was meeting, we heard from veterans, and I don't think we've ever taken any action to deal with the veterans. So I'd like to place the veterans' agenda on our agenda.
So what I've heard, is there any more on this?
I just wanted to comment on the veterans issue since I have some personal interest in that. A number of times people have been trying to get the Veterans Administration to be allowed to even recommend cannabis, much less provide it. And that has not been able to happen in the Congress of the United States, and that's what has to happen. On 3 occasions, I tried to get the Veterans of Foreign Wars to support it, and they would not statewide support it. The American Legion has supported it, and I believe the DAV has supported it as well. So it's a very complicated problem, but is unfortunately is a federal issue that needs to be dealt with. That said, I have no problems putting it on agenda, and maybe this committee can make some things happen.
So I've heard on several new subcommittees, we had 2 subcommittees that we discussed last time that we were going to try to seat. One of the things, the challenges of this last time of using subcommittees is we didn't have any clarity on if there were any particular committees any of our existing committee members would feel passionate about serving on, because again, I can seat them at any time, but not having some idea. So what I'd like to run through is there's been a suggestion on a couple. We won't be able to do them all, just like, I mean, we managed a few this time, and maybe in the future we'll do a couple more. But what I'd like to do is see how each one of our committee members feel about which committee they would like to prioritize their being a member of those committees. So we have from holdover, we have requested one for cultivation. Is there any members of the committee that would feel passionate about being a member of a subcommittee or reconstituted committee on cultivation? So Mr. Wu and Ms. Nevedal, anybody on this side? Okay, so we have 2 volunteers.
If I could just make one point, it might depend upon what the other subcommittees that are going to be available are. So maybe if we run through a list of what you're envisioning, and then we can go through.
Yeah, and they may not all be at the same time, so you can ask for multiple, but we can try to coordinate if more participation is needed. So if you're thinking you might want to be in cultivation, you should do it. So I'll run through the 3 that we have now. One is we had public health and youth. There was an interest by Dr. Cermak to reconstitute that committee. So that'll be one to talk about public health and youth. We had today requests for veterans and tribal subcommittees. And we had the request on, but that's not a subcommittee, but it's a future license discussion for cottage microbusiness licenses for a future agenda. So it isn't a subcommittee, but so those are our outstanding 4.
So that would be cultivation, public health and youth, tribes,
and veterans.
4 different subcommittees.
Correct.
Potentially. Thank you.
Yes.
I think one other one that came up last time, although it wasn't part of your promise to reconstitute at the end, but maybe there's interest in, was reconstituting the enforcement subcommittee. And what's happened? Enforcement. There had previously been an enforcement subcommittee, so, and I believe that came up last time, maybe from Avis, I can't remember. No.
Okay. Thank you for the reminder. All right, and so those are the 5 subcommittee requests. We also need to be able to make sure we get the work done that has to be done, so they won't all be done at one time. I think the way we did this time was better than the past, where we tried to do a half day to each and rush like crazy. Also probably makes it hard on staff getting the recommendations put into a written form for the agenda to discuss. So I'd like the flexibility to schedule those, but I do know that the first 2 that we're going to try to tackle, as well as continuing the equity discussion, is public health and youth and cultivation. Providing timing too. You know, we don't want to end up scheduling a cultivation during the middle of harvest. We won't have very much participation. So working with people that understand those challenges would be part of my decision making.
Sorry, it just was clarified to me in the notes that last time we actually did vote to reconvene an enforcement subcommittee and voted yes.
Oh my goodness.
Everybody
Thank you.
Where is the next meeting?
They haven't disclosed the location yet. We're under the cone of silence. So, just kidding. So we had volunteers. Do we want to reopen up volunteers for the first committee we raised? What's that? So cultivation, we had two, Nevidal and Wu. And then, was there anybody else that wanted to be part of cultivation?
Yeah, I'd be interested in cultivation if the potential to serve on two different committees, subcommittees is available.
Okay, thank you. The next one would be obviously enforcement, now that we were reminded that it was voted and approved and we just hadn't scheduled it. I think there might be a few people in law enforcement in this. Yep. So we have Member Williams.
Member Harada has an interest too.
Member left.
And Member
Nikita as well.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, and then on public health and youth.
Member left.
Member Todd.
Member Heidelbach.
Member Heidelbach. We got too many mics up.
Nikita as well.
I have a question. Could we put public health, the vets, and youth education together?
I'm sure we could. I don't know if either group would feel like they're slighted in not having there, but let me think about that. I can possibly do that.
Jeff, question, are the subcommittees meeting the next one and we're signed up for that, or is this just a general assignment of subcommittees?
Well, we got to work on where the next one's going to be and the date of those, and we could possibly put some on that. And then we could do a special subcommittee meeting. I know that somebody suggested we do a road trip, but I don't know that we can do that because it has to be open to the public and it would be kind of awkward to do a tour, just saying, so.
PEC for public health and youth? We're just doing 3 subcommittees right now, right?
No, I'm going to take as many volunteers as I can, so we can get them scheduled either associated to an existing committee meeting, or if we can do some fill-in if it works out for our ability to secure location and timing. So I'd like to have an idea now so it gives me flexibility to schedule as much as we can that works with what the BCC and the other licensing agencies can help us with.
I imagine too, for some members that aren't here today, like Member Cermak, I imagine he would want to be on, are you taking that in consideration too?
Since he made the motion, he would already be considered as part of my list on the public health and youth. It'll be hard for me to make that determination on the others, so. Any others? No? Veterans?
You.
You, Woolsey, left. Bobulian, Heidelbach, Huffman,
Williams.
and Williams. Any others? Did we miss anybody?
Well, going back to it, it's probably, my guess would be that Member Ron would want to be on enforcement too. Just suggesting.
We're not saying that this is the only people who could be on. My suggestion would be to have somebody from the Bureau to make the call, because I don't want it to become a serial meeting, and I need to be able to talk to whoever becomes the chair about some of the information that will be conducted out of that meeting, so.
Yeah. Ron made the motion to constitute it like Dr. Cermak did.
The enforcement?
Yeah, the enforcement one.
Yeah, right. Very good. Okay. And next item is tribal subcommittee.
Yes.
So we have you, Williams, Sweeney, Peck, I would think Peck, Nevidal,
and Todd.
Huffman, Todd, and Babulian, Did we miss any now? Did we do enforcement yet? I think we did enforcement. I think that wraps up the recommended for subcommittees. Any other agenda items that you think, or speakers that you think would be important for the committee to be able to do their work?
I have an agenda item suggestion, please.
Yes.
So we have heard as a committee multiple times about tax issues, and with the LAO issuing their tax report, I'm wondering if we could agendize a presentation of that tax report and an opportunity for the subcommittee to, or I'm sorry, for the full committee to make recommendations around future tax programs.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Just for a discussionary from my last suggestion. This is just my thought process because we've had a lot of veteran groups testify before us. And what has resonated with me is that it's a public health issue for them and also an education issue for them as well. So that's why I thought conjoining the veteran aspect with the public health and usage education would be a force multiplier.
Okay.
I think we'd get a lot more accomplished than separating them out.
Thank you. I appreciate your thought process on that. All righty. I think, are there public comments on the recommended subcommittees and the agenda items that were recommended? Oh.
I just want to respond to that. It's like keeping bulldogs with chihuahuas.
Please a little closer to the
You
mic.
understand what I'm saying? Yes, it is a public health issue. And yes, we need education, but it really is like training pit bulls with chihuahuas. You don't, yes, for some, you want to integrate the two together, but this is a bigger issue than that. These are very different, separate issues. No offense, with all respect.
None taken. However, I think as a launching point, I think it's a better platform to have a robust discussion. So then you can probably get to the
Combat
critical
veterans won't show up, man.
The critical aspect that I'm speaking to.
Sure, but you need combat veterans to show up.
And they have been.
I understand.
Thank you,
And
Speaker.
at least one sits on the committee.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Any other public comment before I adjourn the meeting? Seeing none, we are adjourned for the session of the CAC. Thank you for all your participation and help. Have safe travel home. Thank you.